Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity takes the long way home, and the past always has a quiet story waiting to be told. Tonight's story is a slow one, made of sand and stone, and the faint sound of wind moving through corridors older than memory. It's a story about something that has stood for so long that it seems less like a monument and more like a thought the earth never forgot to finish. The Great Pyramid of Giza. It's one of those shapes everyone knows before they even learn what it is. A triangle against the horizon, rising out of dust and heat, older than almost everything else still standing in the world. But what if, just for a moment, we imagine something different? What if the Great Pyramid wasn't built by the Egyptians at all? What if it was inherited? That's the idea we'll explore tonight. Not to argue, not to prove, but simply to follow the quiet trail of curiosity that starts when something doesn't quite fit. Because sometimes history isn't only what we know, it's what we've forgotten how to remember. Before we step into the past, though, take a breath. Feel where you are. Maybe you're lying down. Maybe you're listening in the dark. Or maybe the hum of a late evening fills your room. Wherever you are in the world, I'd like to know, what time is it where you are right now? Fitting, perhaps, for a story about a monument that has measured thousands of years without a clock. If you find this kind of wandering through the past soothing or thought-provoking, or even just a peaceful way to end your day, I'd be grateful if you'd give this a like, maybe subscribe, and share it with someone who might need a little quiet curiosity too. It helps this space grow gently, one calm listener at a time. Now, settle in. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let the day loosen its grip. Because this story begins before dynasties, before pharaohs, before the Nile had carved its familiar path through the desert. It begins with stone, and the silence that once surrounded it. The Great Pyramid has always seemed a little out of place, hasn't it? Perfectly aligned to the cardinal points of the compass, shaped with mathematical precision, its vast weight arranged so elegantly that it has survived earthquakes, storms, wars, and endless centuries of shifting sand. To look at it is to feel time itself pause for a moment. It feels older than Egypt, older even than history. The traditional story tells us it was built around 4,500 years ago for Pharaoh Khufu during the 4th dynasty, a project so immense it required decades of labour and tens of thousands of workers. But there are some who look at that story and find it too neat, too complete. They see something that doesn't quite match the tools, the techniques, or the records left behind. They wonder if Khufu built it, or if he found it. That's where our thought begins. What if the Egyptians, those remarkable record keepers and engineers, inherited this monument from a time long before their own? What if they discovered it, restored it, and gave it new meaning? The question doesn't erase their genius. It simply moves the story's starting line back into a foggier age, where floodwaters once ran where sand now lies, and the sky looked just a little different. To imagine such a thing, you have to picture Egypt not as the desert kingdom we know, but as a place of greenery, rain, and rivers that didn't yet know where they should go. The Sahara was once alive. Grasslands, lakes, herds of animals. The climate has shifted many times since. Could it be that in one of those forgotten eras a civilization rose that mastered stone in ways later peoples only half remembered? When Egypt eventually emerged and flourished, could its people have come across these ancient giants and adopted them as their own? The idea isn't new. In ancient Egyptian texts there are whispers of earlier ages. They spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time when gods ruled on earth and knowledge came from the heavens. Later dynasties looked back toward that mythical era with reverence, as though they themselves had inherited echoes of something older. The Great Pyramid, with its mysterious internal passages and astronomical precision, seems to hum with that same tone of inheritance. Its builders, whoever they were, left no inscription claiming ownership. No wall carving says, "Khufu built me." The only reference connecting the pyramid to him comes from later graffiti found inside hidden chambers, marks that might have been added centuries afterward. Even the ancient historians were puzzled. Herodotus, writing 2,000 years after Khufu's reign, admitted he was repeating stories that were already ancient to his informants. They said hundreds of thousands of workers toiled for decades, that ramps of clay and brick rose higher than the monument itself, that the work nearly ruined the country. But Herodotus never saw those ramps, nor did anyone else. No remnants of such colossal infrastructure have ever been found. The logistics alone seem almost mythic, and yet the structure exists, stubbornly real, as if to remind us that something extraordinary happened here, even if the details have slipped away. Look closely at the stone itself. The Great Pyramid's blocks are fitted with such precision that even modern engineers debate how it was achieved with copper tools. Some stones weigh as much as 80 tons. Others, stacked in seamless layers, seem to defy the very idea of human error. Then there's the erosion on the Sphinx and surrounding structures, patterns that some geologists claim come not from wind and sand but from water. Heavy rainfall over long periods. If true, that would date the surface weathering to thousands of years before Khufu's time, when Egypt's climate was far wetter. That alone opens the door to questions. Not proof, but possibility. And possibility is where imagination meets patience, because to inherit something means to live with the mystery of it. The Egyptians were masters of memory. They rebuilt temples on older foundations, restored monuments whose origins they scarcely understood, and filled the gaps with myth and reverence. It's entirely plausible that the early dynasties encountered ruins or structures from an older culture, and folded them into their own history, giving them new life. We do the same today, in quieter ways, renovating old houses, reusing old stories, inheriting beliefs from those who came before us. Civilization, in that sense, is a continuous act of inheritance. If you stand at the base of the pyramid today, you can feel that continuity. The blocks rise above you, the angle so precise that your eyes can barely follow it to the tip. Each layer is a measure of human persistence. But there's also an uncanny sense of déjà vu, as if the stone itself remembers something older than the civilization that adopted it. Perhaps that's what makes it so haunting. It isn't only a tomb or a monument, it's a survivor, a memory in physical form. The idea of inheritance doesn't mean that Egypt was built upon lies. Far from it. It means Egypt may have been the curator of something far more ancient. If Khufu did not build the pyramid, he certainly claimed it. He might have repaired it, reshaped it, or used it as a template for others. The pyramids that followed his, smaller, less perfect, more experimental, look almost like attempts to imitate something they could no longer replicate. Over time, the technique faded. Stone gave way to mud brick. Precision loosened. The art declined. It's as if the original had been an inheritance no one could quite decipher. This pattern appears elsewhere in history. Great monuments that seem beyond their era's capabilities often sit at the edges of forgotten civilizations. In South America, at sites like Pumapunku and Tiwanaku, stone blocks bear tool marks that suggest lost methods. In Lebanon's Baalbek, massive foundation stones lie beneath later Roman temples, far larger than anything the Romans built above them. In Turkey, Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture itself, a site so old that it seems to belong to another chapter of humanity altogether. Perhaps the Great Pyramid belongs to that same silent chapter, one written in stone long before paper, before writing, before we had words for civilization itself. And yet, despite all this speculation, something quietly reassuring lingers in the thought. Whether the Egyptians built it or inherited it, they preserved it. They tended to it. They placed it within a story that gave it purpose. That's what humans do when we find something magnificent. We make it part of our own tale. Maybe that's why the pyramid endures. Not only because it's made of stone, but because every generation that's seen it has accepted its mystery rather than try to erase it. To inherit such a monument would be like waking up one morning to find a mountain carved in your backyard, perfect and precise, but with no name attached. You'd explore it, measure it, claim it, maybe even build your own smaller versions nearby. But deep down, you'd always know it wasn't truly yours. You'd live beside a riddle. The Egyptians, in that sense, were neighbours to a mystery that became part of their identity. Imagine those early generations walking among the Giza Plateau, the Nile flooding nearby, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and palm. The pyramid would have loomed above them, already ancient, already waiting. They might have seen it not as something made by men, but as something left behind by gods. And maybe that's why their myths speak of divine builders, of Thoth, of Ra, of those who came from the stars. When a civilization inherits a monument beyond its comprehension, mythology fills the gap where knowledge once lived. The story of the Great Pyramid, inherited or not, is a reminder that knowledge can be both fragile and resilient. It can survive in stone while vanishing from memory. It can outlive languages, empires, entire climates. The Egyptians, perhaps unknowingly, became the custodians of something that belonged to a much older world, a world washed away by floods, buried under centuries of silence. And yet, through them, the monument continued to breathe. Even today, standing before it, we feel that same breath, the sense that we are latecomers to a conversation that began before history learned to write. We read it through measurements, alignments, and erosion patterns. But the language itself remains half forgotten. Still, the pyramid speaks in its own way. In the sharp edge of its shadow, in the cool echo of its chambers, in the alignment of its corners with the stars. It whispers that time is not a straight line, that civilizations rise, fall, and sometimes rediscover fragments of themselves centuries later. The stone that waited for history didn't need to remember who built it. It only needed to endure long enough for someone to ask again. And here we are, thousands of years later, still asking, still wondering, still feeling that peculiar blend of awe and humility that comes from realizing how much bigger the past might be than we ever imagined. So tonight, as the desert cools and the stars begin their patient turning over Giza, let the mind wander back to that first moment when humans saw the pyramid not as a project, but as a mystery. Imagine the silence of discovery, the moment of realizing that something vast and deliberate already stood where the horizon met the sky. That's where our story truly begins, not with Khufu's hammer or his architect's plans, but with the quiet awe of those who first saw the stone and realized it had been waiting for them all along. And as that thought settles, the desert stretches onward, calm and unhurried. The wind moves over the sand, tracing lines where water once flowed, and the pyramid watches as it always has. Ahead lies the deeper mystery. Who built it, when, and why the memory faded. The next part of our journey will follow those faint traces beneath the sand, where whispers of a forgotten world wait to be heard again. The morning sun over the Nile is a kind of light that belongs only to Egypt. It pours across the desert like liquid gold, soft at first, then blinding, washing over stone and sand alike until everything glows with the same quiet fire. The Great Pyramid stands in that light as though it was designed for it, its lines catching the dawn the way an old instrument catches sound. It's hard to imagine a time when that light rose over Giza and found no pharaohs, no cities, only wind and the whisper of shifting dunes. But that may be where the story of inheritance truly begins, when Egypt awoke and found the giants already waiting. In the earliest chapters of Egypt's own history, before the first kings carved their names into stone, before the hieroglyphs learned to speak, there were people moving through the Nile Valley who did not yet call themselves Egyptians. They were farmers, herders, traders along the river that gave everything life. The desert beyond was a place of spirits, of old things, of stories told beside fires when the wind grew cold after sunset. They must have seen shapes on the horizon, unnatural, geometric, strange, blocks rising in patterns too perfect to be accidents of nature. And perhaps, long before writing recorded it, the first murmurs began. Who built them? For a civilization like Egypt, which would one day master the art of memory, those early encounters would have been the beginning of legend. To find a structure already ancient, already beyond comprehension, is to meet the past face to face. If the Great Pyramid predated the dynasties, it would have been the first mystery written into Egypt's soul. Imagine standing in that early dawn, the air cooler than it is now, the Nile swollen and wide, its banks lush with papyrus and reeds. Ahead, a mountain of carved stone rises from the mist. Its sides gleam as though polished by the gods. There are no hieroglyphs on it, no names, no signs of its maker, only silence and perfection. That silence might have been both terrifying and comforting. In a world filled with change and uncertainty, here was something unchanging, unmoving, eternal. It would have drawn people the way fire draws the cold. At first, perhaps, they approached cautiously. They might have built small shrines near its base, left offerings, whispered prayers. The idea that the gods once walked the earth could have taken shape right there at its shadow. And in time, those whispers became stories, and those stories became belief. The Egyptians later said their civilization began in the time of the gods, in the age called Zep Tepi, the first time. Maybe that myth began as an attempt to explain the inexplicable, a way to describe the inheritance of a monument so ancient that only gods could have made it. Archaeologists today sift through layers of sand that represent thousands of years, each stratum a chapter of climate and culture. What we call ancient Egypt was, in reality, the flowering of something that had been growing for millennia. Before Khufu's dynasty, there were earlier cultures, Naqada, Badarian, pre-dynastic groups who left pottery, graves, tools. Traces of lives lived in small settlements along the river's edge. Yet, if the Great Pyramid stood before them, their world would have been defined by its presence. Imagine living in a village of mud brick huts and looking out across the horizon to see a monument of stone so vast and precise that it seemed to mock time itself. It would have been as natural to them as the rising sun, and just as mysterious. Even the later Egyptians treated the pyramids with reverence that felt older than ownership. In the Old Kingdom, the builders of new pyramids aligned their own with the Giza Plateau, as if following an ancestral pattern they didn't fully understand. By the Middle Kingdom, the old pyramids were already ancient monuments, weathered but sacred. Temples were built near them. Prayers were written invoking their endurance, but rarely did anyone claim to have raised them. To stand near Giza was to stand near the beginning. The sands around the pyramids tell their own story, one of cycles. For thousands of years they've buried and revealed again. When Napoleon's army arrived in 1798, the pyramids were half swallowed by sand. His soldiers recorded the struggle of climbing dunes to reach the base. In earlier centuries, Arab chroniclers wrote of hidden chambers, forgotten passages, treasures sealed beneath layers of time. They called the Great Pyramid the Mountain of Pharaoh, but some thought it was older still, perhaps built by a king before the flood. That idea, that the monument predates the deluge described in so many ancient myths, echoes in many cultures. Sumerian, Hebrew and Egyptian traditions all speak of a cataclysm that erased a golden age. Could it be that the pyramid belonged to that vanished chapter, its tip surviving the flood while everything else was swept away? Geologists studying the plateau have found signs that once the region was subject to heavy rainfall, carving channels in the limestone. The weathering patterns on the Sphinx enclosure seem to suggest water erosion, not mere wind. That would place the origin of those surfaces at a time when Egypt's climate was far wetter, perhaps 8 or even 10,000 years ago. The official chronology resists this, of course. Orthodoxy holds firm to the 4th dynasty, 2500 BCE. But if you allow the sands to whisper a little longer, another timeline begins to emerge, a line stretching back into a period of global instability, when ice sheets melted, sea levels rose, and civilizations along coastlines were washed away. If Egypt's ancestors stumbled upon the remains of a much older culture, their reverence makes sense. The earliest Egyptian symbols, like the Ankh and the Djid pillar, carry meanings of life and stability, concepts that would resonate strongly in a world recovering from catastrophe. To inherit something that survived the flood would be to hold proof that permanence was possible. The Great Pyramid, then, might not just have been a tomb or a temple. It might have been a promise, a reminder that human hands, guided by knowledge now lost, once built something that could outlast disaster. When early kings began to unite Upper and Lower Egypt, they built upon this foundation of myth. The pharaoh was not just a ruler, but the bridge between the human and the divine, the restorer of order after chaos. It's easy to see how the presence of an ancient monument, silent, perfect, eternal, could have inspired that very idea. The pyramid could have been seen as the ultimate symbol of Ma'at, the Egyptian principle of balance and cosmic harmony. It stood as proof that such harmony had once existed in a more complete form, a time worth emulating. As the centuries passed, that sense of inheritance deepened. The builders of later pyramids might not have known who first set the stones of Giza, but they carried the tradition forward, trying to recreate a pattern that had already been perfected. Some succeeded partially, others failed dramatically, their structures collapsing as if to remind them that imitation was not understanding. The Pyramid Age came and went, leaving the Great Pyramid as the pinnacle of something that perhaps didn't start with Egypt at all. The sands would later bury much of this legacy, sealing it away during the dry centuries that followed. Bedouins passed through, travellers recorded tales, and the desert grew quieter around the stones. But underneath, the plateau still held its memory. When modern excavators began clearing the site in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found traces of settlements, ramps, tools, evidence of human activity, yes, but not the colossal infrastructure one would expect for a project of such magnitude. The stones seemed too perfect, too numerous, too deliberate. Some researchers suggested the possibility of earlier work, later reused or expanded. Others proposed that the Egyptians had access to techniques or machinery now lost. Each theory carried its own kind of faith. To walk at Giza today is to walk through layers of belief. Tourists, archaeologists, mystics, and skeptics all stand before the same monument, each seeing something different. Some see human genius, others see divine intervention. Still others see the fingerprints of a forgotten civilization that vanished long before recorded history. The pyramid itself offers no opinion. It simply endures, as it always has, watching the world change and the Nile shift course. Its stones hold the heat of day and the chill of night, just as they did thousands of years ago when the first curious eyes looked upon them. If Egypt truly inherited the pyramid, then the relationship between civilization and memory changes. The Egyptians would not have been the inventors of greatness, but its stewards, guardians of something older than their language. And perhaps that's what makes their culture so remarkable. They didn't destroy what they couldn't explain. They preserved it. They turned mystery into meaning. The gods of Egypt, with their animal faces and cosmic roles, may have been reflections of principles older than the Nile itself. Their temples, aligned with the stars, may have been attempts to restore a pattern first set in stone by unknown ancestors. Somewhere beneath the sand, beneath the centuries of rebuilding, lie traces of that first encounter, the moment when Egypt met its inheritance. It might have been the discovery of a doorway, a chamber, a shape beneath the dunes. It might have been as simple as a child's gaze lifted toward a stone that didn't belong to the desert around it. However it happened, it set in motion one of humanity's longest relationships with the past. The Egyptians would spend thousands of years conversing with their ancestors, whether real or imagined, through monuments, myths, and rituals designed to keep memory alive. And perhaps, deep within those rituals, echoes of the true builders still linger, the way a melody lingers after the instrument falls silent. Even now, the sands continue their slow dance around Giza. They move in currents, uncovering a block here, burying another there. Each gust of wind writes and erases history at once. Archaeologists brush away layers that may have taken centuries to settle, revealing glimpses of forgotten craftsmanship. But for every answer found, another question appears. The plateau is like a palimpsest, a manuscript written and rewritten by time, and somewhere beneath all those revisions lies the first line, the one that began before Egypt had a name. As the daylight fades and the heat slips away, the desert takes on a strange stillness. The air cools, the stones release their warmth, and for a brief moment the Great Pyramid seems to float against the dusk. It's easy to imagine the first Egyptians watching that same twilight thousands of years ago, feeling the same quiet awe. They might have whispered prayers, lit small fires, and wondered what kind of hands had shaped such a thing. The answer never came, not clearly. But perhaps it didn't need to. The act of wondering was enough. It connected them to something greater than themselves, to time, to endurance, to the mystery of creation itself. The sands have always known more than they reveal. They hide the truth with one hand and offer hints with the other. And in that balance lies the beauty of inheritance. To inherit is to live with mystery, to tend to it, to keep it safe even when you don't fully understand it. Egypt did that. The Great Pyramid still stands as proof. It is both artifact and teacher, a monument not only to those who built it, but to those who cared enough to keep it alive. Night gathers slowly over Giza, and the stars return one by one, ancient companions of the stones. Their light falls across the desert in the same patterns it did thousands of years ago, before the first hieroglyph, before the first name. Somewhere in that silence, in that shared rhythm of sky and stone, lies the memory of when Egypt first looked upon the Great Pyramid and realized it was not the beginning of something, but the continuation of something far older. And as that thought lingers, the horizon grows softer, the air cooler, and the story continues, deeper into the enigma of those who came before and the forgotten world they may have left behind. When ancient Egyptians spoke of the beginning of all things, they didn't start with kings or kingdoms. They started with silence. They called it Zep-Tepi, the first time, when the gods walked upon the earth, when the waters receded, and the world emerged from chaos into order. To them, it wasn't merely a story, it was memory, a distant echo of something too vast, too ancient, to fit neatly within human history. That phrase, the first time, has always carried the scent of something older than mythology. It hints at a past erased not by neglect, but by catastrophe. Across cultures, across continents, the same whisper appears, of a world before ours, a world drowned and forgotten. In the temples of Egypt, carved on stone walls that have watched the sun rise for millennia, fragments of that lost memory survive. Gods descending from the heavens, kings ruling for thousands of years before the flood, knowledge bestowed, then scattered. It's as though the people of the Nile inherited not just land and monuments, but a story, one passed down from survivors who had seen the world end once already. If the Great Pyramid truly predates the dynastic age, it might belong to that vanished world. Perhaps it was the masterpiece of a civilization that vanished beneath water or time, leaving behind only this single, indestructible artifact. The flood myths of Mesopotamia, the deluge of Genesis, the inundation of the Nile itself, they all share the same pattern. destruction followed by renewal. The Egyptians believed that from the waters of chaos called Nun, the first mound of creation rose, and upon that mound stood the god Etum, bringing life into existence. The shape of the pyramid mirrors that cosmic hill, a symbol of rebirth, a stairway from earth to heaven. But what if that symbolism was itself inherited from an age when the flood wasn't a story but a memory? The more you look, the more the echoes align. Sumerian tablets tell of gods who ruled before the flood for tens of thousands of years. Greek philosophers spoke of Atlantis, a great island empire swallowed by the sea. Indian texts recall cities lost beneath the waves. Even the Andes and Pacific Islands hold tales of ancient teachers who arrived after cataclysms, bringing back knowledge of farming, building, and stars. These myths, scattered across geography yet united in theme, suggest that something, some global disruption, once reset the human story. And when it ended, perhaps a handful of survivors carried fragments of memory to new lands. The Nile, stable and fertile, would have been a natural refuge. If that is true, the Great Pyramid could be a remnant of their presence, a monument not built in the dawn of civilization, but preserved from its twilight. The gods of Egypt, then, might not be gods at all, but deified memories of those who came before. People so advanced, so skilled, that to the early Egyptians they seemed divine. Inscriptions describe Thoth, the god of wisdom, as the keeper of hidden knowledge, the measurer of the heavens, the scribe of eternity. His symbols, the stylus, the scales, the crescent moon, hint at an understanding of mathematics and astronomy older than any surviving record. Could Thoth have been the memory of an engineer, a scholar from that pre-flood world, remembered through the soft lens of myth? There's a peculiar consistency in the way ancient cultures describe their ancestors, not as primitive hunters, but as masters of geometry, of time, of celestial motion. They speak of a golden age when humanity and the cosmos moved in harmony. Then something changed, a flood, a tilt, a fall from grace, and the survivors began again. In Egypt, that sense of restoration runs deep. The rituals of the pharaohs were not acts of innovation but acts of remembrance. Each temple, each statue, was built to maintain balance, to recreate the order that once existed. Their architecture was not only functional, it was cosmic. The orientation of the pyramids to true north, the alignment of shafts to specific stars, the proportions reflecting mathematical constants, all suggest that the builders, whether Egyptian or inherited predecessors, were working from a knowledge of the heavens. Astronomers have long noted that the layout of the Giza pyramids mirrors the belt of Orion. The ancients associated that constellation with Osiris, god of resurrection. In their cosmology, the stars were not distant points of light but the eternal homes of divine beings. To ascend to the stars was to return to the source. The pyramid, with its internal passages and chambers aligned to the night sky, might have been designed as a bridge between worlds, not just for the dead king, but for the species itself, a monument to the memory of those who had come from the stars, or perhaps simply remembered them better than we do. If we trace that thread backward, beyond dynasties and temples, the image that forms is haunting. A civilization with mastery over stone and alignment, wiped out by the rising seas of the last ice age's end. The Younger Dryas period, around 12,000 years ago, marked a sudden catastrophic shift in global climate. Vast ice sheets melted, ocean levels rose hundreds of feet, and the landscapes of early humanity changed forever. In that chaos, entire cultures could vanish without a trace. What would survive such destruction? Not wood, not bronze, not parchment, only stone. The kind of stone cut, fitted and aligned to endure even the sky's slow turning. When the floodwaters finally receded, perhaps some of those survivors returned to the places they once called sacred, only to find their monuments half buried, their knowledge fractured. They began again, teaching fragments of what they remembered to those who had never seen the world before. Over generations, those fragments became myth, and myth became religion. The memory of the builders was preserved not in blueprints, but in stories of gods who shaped the earth and measured the stars. The Egyptians may have inherited those stories first, then the stones that inspired them. There are small hints left in their language. The word for pyramid, mer, carries meanings linked to ascension and light. The hieroglyphs associated with creation, the mound, the rays of the sun, the bird rising, echo the same geometry as the structure itself. It's as though the entire culture was built around preserving a single principle, that life, death, and rebirth follow the same upward path. To the inheritors of such a monument, the pyramid would have been more than architecture. It would have been scripture carved in limestone. Even the Book of the Dead, written thousands of years after the supposed construction of Giza, describes the soul's journey as a passage through chambers guided by stars toward rebirth in light. Its imagery parallels the physical layout of the pyramid's corridors and shafts, almost as if the structure inspired the ritual rather than the other way around. Perhaps the book was not a manual for the afterlife, but a memory of the monument's original purpose, a map of transformation handed down through generations. If we accept the idea that the Great Pyramid is older than Egypt, its perfection begins to make sense. It was not a first experiment. It was the final expression of an art perfected long before. The pyramids that followed, smaller, rougher, more flawed, were the echoes, the imitations of something their makers only partly understood. Just as a song can outlast its composer, the design endured even when the technique was lost. Over time, Egypt's builders became not innovators, but restorers, trying to recover what their ancestors once knew. Every culture leaves behind a shadow of what it once feared losing. For Egypt, that shadow was the flood, the chaotic waters of Nun. The annual inundation of the Nile became both a reminder and a ritual reenactment of that ancient cataclysm. Each year the waters rose, covered the land, and then receded, leaving behind fertile soil and renewal. Life emerged again, just as the old world might have emerged from disaster. The people built their cities along that rhythm, seeing in it the pattern of all creation. And at Giza, the pyramid stood as the physical embodiment of that truth, order carved from chaos, permanence built upon renewal. To imagine that it was inherited rather than built is not to strip Egypt of its greatness. It is to see it as part of a longer continuum, a civilization that caught the last note of a song the earth itself had nearly forgotten. Their myths of gods arriving from the sky, bringing language, architecture, and timekeeping, may have been distant recollections of those ancient teachers who survived the flood. The gods of Zep-Tepi might have been the last scientists of a world that had learned to harness knowledge through geometry and celestial observation. When their civilization fell, they became legends, and the Great Pyramid became their testament. Some scholars, unwilling to take that leap, call these stories coincidence. They say myths arise naturally, that floods are universal experiences, that every culture invents gods to explain the unknown. Perhaps that's true. Yet beneath that logic lies something harder to dismiss, the persistence of the same specific symbols across ages and continents. The serpent, the flood, the star, the mountain, the rebirth. They appear too often, too consistently to be pure invention. They feel like memories shared through time's veil, reshaped but never erased. If a forgotten civilization once spanned the world, its memory might live on not in ruins but in ideas. The belief that knowledge and order must be maintained, that the stars mirror our own existence, that humanity's task is to rebuild what was lost. These ideas form the heart of Egypt's worldview. The Great Pyramid, silent and immovable, stands at that intersection between myth and memory, where the human need for meaning meets the possibility of inheritance. The flood may have erased the cities and the names of the builders, but it could not erase their intention. To endure, to be remembered, to outlast the sea, the wind, and time itself. In that sense, they succeeded. We may not know who they were, but we live in the world they left behind. Every discovery, every attempt to understand the past is part of the same ancient impulse, to connect with those who came before and to honour what they tried to preserve. In the quiet hours of night, when the desert cools and the stars burn sharp above the plateau, the air seems thick with that memory. The constellations look down on the same stone they once guided, and the line between myth and history grows thin. Perhaps that's what the Egyptians felt too, the sense that they were walking in the footsteps of giants, living in a world built upon the ruins of another. They gave those giants names, carved their stories in hieroglyphs, and built temples to echo their wisdom. The builders themselves faded into legend, but their message endured in limestone and light. Somewhere between the myths of the gods and the science of stone, the truth waits, not as a revelation, but as a quiet understanding. That the earth keeps its own records, written in weathered rock and shifting sands. The Great Pyramid may be one of those records, a monument not just to human ingenuity but to continuity itself. It bridges ages, connecting the world before the flood to the world after, the unknown builders to those who inherited their legacy, the gods of the first time to the kings of the Nile. And so the story moves forward, carried by the river, guided by the stars, whispering still through the corridors of the pyramid where light and silence meet. What came before Egypt might never be fully known, but its breath lingers in the dust, its echo in every stone. The floodwaters have long since receded, but their reflection remains, shimmering faintly in the memory of a civilization that looked upon a monument older than itself and called it divine. The desert holds that memory still, waiting, as it always does, for someone to listen long enough to hear it. And as the night deepens, the sands begin to cool, and the line of the horizon blurs into shadow once more. The story drifts onward, toward the stones themselves and the strange, silent clues they left behind. If you ever stand close enough to touch the Great Pyramid, the first thing you notice is that it doesn't feel like any other ancient ruin. Most old structures, even grand ones, show the fatigue of centuries. Chipped corners, uneven lines, the wear of wind and rain. But the stones of Giza seem to resist that narrative. They hold their edges with a defiance that feels deliberate, almost aware. Each block seems to have been placed not just for strength, but for permanence. And yet, even with all that precision, something strange hides in plain sight. Erosion that shouldn't be there. Marks that don't belong to the desert. When sunlight passes over the pyramid in the early morning, shadows crawl through the seams between the stones. Those seams are impossibly thin, often less than a millimetre wide. You can barely fit the edge of a knife between them, though the blocks themselves weigh several tons each. There's a logic to that kind of precision, but it's a logic that seems ahead of its time. Copper chisels, the supposed tools of the builders, dull quickly against limestone. Copper bends long before stone yields. Even with endless labour, the idea of cutting and fitting more than 2 million blocks to such perfection feels less like craftsmanship and more like an engineering language we no longer speak. Walk around the base and look at the remaining casing stones, those few gleaming survivors that once covered the entire structure in white Tura limestone. Their surfaces are polished smooth, still reflecting light even after thousands of years. Each one curves slightly outward, compensating for the subtle concavity of the pyramid's faces, a detail invisible from afar but deliberate in design. It means the builders understood optical illusion. They built the pyramid not as a simple geometric solid, but as something that would appear perfectly straight under the distortion of sunlight and distance. That's not just skill, that's foresight. Then there are the foundation blocks hidden beneath the sand, fitted directly into the bedrock of the plateau. They form a base so level that even modern laser measurements find less than a few centimetres of deviation across the entire footprint. To achieve that on an uneven limestone shelf would require a surveying accuracy rivaling what we accomplish with modern instruments. It raises a question the sand refuses to answer. Were those foundations cut by the same civilization that left the upper courses, or were they older still, the last surviving layer of an earlier age upon which the Egyptians built? The deeper you look, the more the stones themselves become a record, not of who placed them, but of what they endured. Some blocks bear channels and pits worn into them, as though by long exposure to water. They curve and ripple, smoothed not by wind but by flow. The Sphinx enclosure nearby shows similar marks, patterns of vertical erosion, the kind caused by heavy rainfall, not the horizontal scouring of desert wind. Yet the Sahara hasn't seen sustained rainfall of that magnitude in thousands of years. If those marks are truly from water, they must belong to a time when Egypt was not a desert but a savanna, perhaps even before the end of the Ice Age. That single observation pushes the pyramid's possible age far beyond the accepted timeline. Geologists who study the plateau's strata speak of fluctuating climates, of a green Sahara and vast lakes that once dotted the land. Satellite imagery reveals the ghostly outlines of ancient riverbeds now buried under sand. The Nile itself has shifted course countless times, carving and abandoning channels. Somewhere in those forgotten paths the pyramid may have once stood on a fertile plain, not surrounded by dunes but by life. A monument built, or inherited, in a landscape unrecognizable to us now. If it really is older than history remembers, the erosion makes sense. The water would have lapped against its base, seeping into cracks, leaving behind patterns that wind alone could never reproduce. Over centuries, as the land dried and the desert took hold, the marks of that earlier climate became part of the stone's surface, clues from a time when Egypt breathed differently. And yet, despite this evidence, mainstream chronology resists the idea. It must, because to move the pyramid's age back even a few thousand years unravels the entire timeline of early civilization. Agriculture, metallurgy, writing, all would have to be older than we currently believe. It's easier, perhaps, to imagine the Egyptians mastering techniques that left no trace than to accept the possibility that the world before them was more advanced than we've assumed. Still, the stones speak in their own language. Some bear tool marks too fine to come from pounding or chipping. Others show a kind of internal polish, as if cut or shaped by heat or vibration rather than brute force. In places, the surfaces are so flat that modern engineers have compared them to machine-cut tolerances. If these impressions are the result of lost methods, what kind of knowledge did it take to create them? Perhaps not magic, but something we've simply forgotten. A kind of engineering intuition honed over centuries and then wiped clean by catastrophe. There's a strange humility in realizing how easily knowledge can vanish. We look at the pyramid and assume upward progress, that ancient people were climbing toward our level of understanding. But what if the line of progress isn't upward at all? What if it's circular? A cycle of rise, fall, and rediscovery, each civilization adding a layer of memory over the ruins of the one before. The precision of Giza could be the residue of a cycle that had already peaked once. When the flood came or the climate shifted, the memory of how was lost, but the evidence remained, silent, immovable, misunderstood. The precision isn't limited to the stones themselves. The entire complex seems to have been designed according to a unified geometry. The pyramid's height, multiplied by a certain ratio, matches the circumference of the Earth. Its base perimeter relates to its height in the same proportion that defines the circle, the mathematical constant pi, accurate to several decimal places. These are relationships not necessary for a tomb, but essential for a monument meant to encode knowledge. It's as if the structure was a message written in the universal language of numbers, waiting for a future intelligent species, us, to notice. At night, when the wind drops and the stars come out, the pyramid becomes a different kind of instrument. The sharpness of its edges dissolves in the dim light, and it seems to merge with the horizon, aligning itself with constellations the way a compass aligns with the north. The shafts inside its chambers point precisely toward Orion's belt and towards Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. Those alignments weren't accidental. They tie the structure to celestial events that occurred around 10,000 BCE, far earlier than Khufu's reign. If that alignment was intentional, then whoever designed the pyramid was mapping a sky that no longer existed by the time Egypt rose to power. Stone keeps better time than any clock. Its surface remembers every drop of rain, every gust of wind, every human hand that ever touched it. When you trace your fingers along the limestone, you're reading that memory. The rough patches speak of sandstorms, the smooth ones of shelter. The deeper grooves, though, tell a story of water and weather that do not belong to the Egypt we know. Each groove is a signature of a climate that vanished, and with it perhaps the builders who once understood how to tame stone with such grace. The erosion isn't the only mystery. Beneath the pyramid lies a network of tunnels and chambers carved into the bedrock. Some were known to the ancients, others have only recently been detected by ground-penetrating radar. The full extent of that labyrinth remains unknown, but its scale suggests planning beyond a single pharaoh's lifetime. Some passages run deeper than necessary, branching into unfinished corridors that end abruptly. Were they experiments, extensions, or remnants of an earlier design repurposed by later builders? No one can say for certain. The Egyptians of the Old Kingdom recorded their deeds meticulously, yet not a single contemporary text describes the construction of the Great Pyramid in detail. That silence, in a culture obsessed with documentation, is almost as telling as the precision itself. Perhaps they didn't describe it because they didn't build it. Perhaps by the time Khufu came to power, the pyramid already stood, eroded, enigmatic, but still intact. His role might have been that of renovator, not architect. He could have restored the outer casing, inscribed his name where no one else had, and claimed the structure as his own, ensuring his immortality alongside a monument that had already survived thousands of years. To later generations, his claim became fact, and the true origins faded into the comfort of official history. The idea sounds audacious until you stand before the monument and feel its scale. It doesn't seem like the product of a single reign or a human lifetime. It feels older, more patient, as if it grew rather than was built. The precision, the erosion, the silent chambers beneath, all of it suggests a story that began long before Khufu, maybe even before the Nile had settled into its modern course. Some geologists have taken samples from the plateau and found traces of ancient seashells embedded in the rock, fossils from when this land was the bed of a primordial sea. The builders, whoever they were, chose that foundation deliberately, stone already ancient when they began. They built atop the memory of oceans, perhaps as a symbol of endurance, perhaps as a warning. And when their own age ended, the monument remained, carrying both its message and its mystery into the future. Over the centuries, erosion continued its quiet work, softening edges, deepening cracks, reminding the stone that even permanence is a negotiation with time. But the core geometry, the alignment, the symmetry, refused to yield. Even as blocks fell and surfaces weathered, the overall form held true. It's as though the design anticipated decay, accounting for it the way architects today account for stress and weight. That kind of foresight implies more than skill. It implies philosophy. The builders understood that perfection isn't something to be maintained forever, but something to be aimed at knowing it will eventually fade. Standing in the cool shadow of the pyramid's base, you can feel that idea settle in. The air carries the smell of dust and distant water. The stone radiates the day's heat, a warmth older than any empire. Every block seems to hum with a memory that language can't quite capture. You look at the erosion marks, at the perfect seams, and the mind drifts between two possibilities. That human hands did this with unimaginable effort, or that it came from an age when effort and knowledge were one and the same. Either way, what remains defies the limits we try to place on the past. As twilight deepens, the surface of the pyramid changes colour. Gold fades to amber, amber to grey, then grey to black. The stars return, the same stars that once guided those invisible builders. Their light slides over the eroded stones, tracing the grooves like fingertips reading braille. Each mark, each indentation, each curve shaped by water and time becomes a word in a story too vast to finish. The puzzle of precision and erosion doesn't demand an answer. It asks for awareness, that sense of humility that comes from realizing how little we truly know. Whether the pyramid stones were cut by copper chisels or by methods long forgotten, whether the erosion speaks of rain or of deeper mysteries, the result is the same. A monument that defies its supposed age and refuses to surrender its origin. The desert wind begins again, gentle at first, then steady, sliding grains of sand against the ancient limestone. Each gust erases a footprint, smooths a ridge, polishes another corner. The process repeats endlessly, the slow rewriting of history in motion. And as the night settles fully over Giza, the pyramid remains as it always has, eroded yet exact, weathered yet perfect, silent yet full of meaning. Somewhere beyond its base the sands shift again, revealing and concealing fragments of stone that lead outward into the plateau, as if pointing toward the next layer of the riddle. The marks of precision meet the signs of weathering, and between them lies the unspoken truth that something old, perhaps impossibly old, once shaped this land and left behind its memory in stone. And so the journey continues, from the physical to the symbolic, from what the eyes can see to what the myths once tried to explain. The wind moves on, carrying that silence across the desert, toward the river that still feeds life along its banks. The water glimmers faintly under the stars, the same stars that shine on the pyramid's worn edges. Somewhere between their reflection and the rippling current, the story flows onward, deeper into the enigma of meaning, inheritance, and the language carved into stone by hands we no longer recognize. If the Great Pyramid had truly been a royal project, the record should have been deafening. Ancient Egypt left behind an unbroken chain of names, dates, prayers, and triumphs, carved into every stone they raised. Pharaohs documented their reigns with a devotion that bordered on obsession. They recorded victories that never happened and floods that never came. They wrote their names on temples, tombs, and even quarry walls miles from the Nile, making sure time would never forget who they were. Yet the Great Pyramid, the most extraordinary monument of all, is silent. It carries no proclamation, no dedicatory text, no boast of its creator. It simply stands, anonymous and perfect, as though built by hands that didn't need to be remembered. That silence has troubled historians for centuries. The Egyptians were not shy about credit. Even the smallest tombs bear inscriptions celebrating their builders, their families, their offerings to the gods. But inside the Great Pyramid, the walls are blank. Smooth limestone corridors lead into chambers devoid of hieroglyphs. The only markings found there, red paint on hidden blocks above the king's chamber, are crude quarry signs, names of work gangs, and a cartouche that reads Khufu. Those faint symbols, discovered in the 19th century, have been treated as proof of authorship ever since. But they sit in a space few eyes were ever meant to see, in chambers sealed off during construction. The debate has never quite settled. Some scholars suggest those marks were added by the builders. Others whisper that they might have been added much later, perhaps by early explorers eager to solve the mystery. Whatever the truth, the pyramid itself remains mute. That muteness sets it apart from every other pyramid in Egypt. The later monuments, smaller and less precise, are dense with inscriptions, religious texts, stars painted on ceilings, spells from the pyramid texts meant to guide the pharaoh's soul through the afterlife. They describe the journey of the king toward the stars, the opening of the mouth ceremony, the offerings of food and light. But in Khufu's pyramid, There are no spells, no stars, no carved instructions for eternity. It's as though the builders knew that the structure itself was enough, that it didn't need words to do its work. The absence feels deliberate, like a language older than hieroglyphs, a message spoken through shape and symmetry instead of script. Egyptian hieroglyphs themselves are a kind of mirror. They're not just pictures, they're memories, symbols inherited and refined over time. Some of them, like the Ankh, the Jed pillar, or the scepter, appear fully formed in the earliest inscriptions, as though they had been copied from an older source. They show no period of development, no primitive sketches. The system emerges suddenly, sophisticated and complete, around the same era that the pyramids reached their peak. It's as if both architecture and language were echoes of something already mastered elsewhere, a knowledge remembered rather than invented. The word the Egyptians used for writing was Medu Netja, the words of the gods. They believed hieroglyphs were divine, not human, that their shapes preserved the original language of creation. To carve them was to channel sacred power. The god Thoth, credited as their inventor, was said to have written the universe itself into existence. Perhaps that belief was not symbolic, but historical. A distant recollection of a time when symbols truly did encode knowledge of the natural world, when writing and science were not separate, when the act of inscribing something into stone was also the act of preserving truth. That sense of divine inheritance runs through Egyptian culture. When they rebuilt old temples, they didn't claim them as new. They restored them as they were in the time of the ancestors. Inscriptions often say that a king found the temple in ruins and rebuilt it according to the writings of old. Those writings, now lost, may have been plans, measurements, or rituals copied from texts already ancient to the Old Kingdom. The Egyptians saw themselves not as creators, but as caretakers of a tradition that stretched back to the first time. Every carving, every formula, was a way of keeping faith with a world that had once been perfect. That attitude makes the Great Pyramid's silence all the more striking. If they truly built it, why not dedicate it? Why not inscribe even a single hymn to the gods who inspired it? Perhaps the builders believed the pyramid itself was already sacred, a relic from that earlier time, its design carrying power that words could only diminish. To add a name would have been to intrude upon something divine. So they left it blank, and centuries later, Khufu's name was painted on the hidden stones above, like a label on an inheritance no one fully understood. The deeper meaning of inheritance in Egypt was more than material. It was spiritual continuity, the passing of order through generations. The word mat defined that principle: harmony, truth, balance. The king was its guardian, not its inventor. To live within Met was to maintain the rhythm of the cosmos, to ensure that everything stayed as it was meant to be. Perhaps the silence of the Great Pyramid was itself an expression of Met, an act of preservation so pure that it needed no explanation. To carve hieroglyphs on it would have been like writing on the sky. If we imagine that the structure was older, built by a culture that predated Egypt, the absence of inscriptions becomes easier to understand. Language evolves quickly, stone does not. The script of the builders could have been lost long before the first pharaoh took the throne. By the time the Egyptians discovered or restored the pyramid, its symbols, if any existed, might already have faded into the stone or been buried beneath new blocks. All that remained was the form, the universal grammar of geometry, circles, angles, ratios, the language of measurement itself, a language that needs no translation. Inside the pyramid, the corridors rise and fall with strange precision, as though charting an invisible map. Some lead nowhere, others open into chambers whose purpose remains unclear. The Grand Gallery, with its soaring roof of corbelled limestone, seems designed for more than passage. Its acoustics are remarkable. A single sound made there can resonate for several seconds, filling the air like the hum of a tuning fork. Engineers who have studied it suggest it could have been used to test resonance, perhaps even to amplify vibrations through the structure. If that's true, then the builders spoke a language of physics, not prose, one that used sound, light, and proportion to express meaning. Imagine walking there thousands of years ago, a torch in hand, the flame reflecting off smooth walls. No inscriptions to guide you, only the feeling that every inch of stone has been measured against the stars. You wouldn't need words to understand that you were standing inside something deliberate, something alive with purpose. The silence itself would be the message. Egyptologists often describe the Great Pyramid as a tomb, but if it was an unusually empty one. No sarcophagus inscribed with prayers, no treasure, no mummies. The granite coffer inside the king's chamber is plain, undecorated, and too large to fit through the passages leading to it. It must have been placed there during construction, long before the corridors were sealed. But why leave it empty? Perhaps it was never meant to hold a body at all. Perhaps it was part of the design, a resonant chamber tuned to specific frequencies, part of the same hidden language that speaks through the pyramid's proportions. There's a curious parallel here. The oldest surviving texts in Egypt, the pyramid texts of the 5th and 6th dynasties, appear long after the Great Pyramid was built. They seem to echo ideas that must have existed earlier. Invocations to the stars, formulas of ascent, references to the first time. It's as though the Egyptians were transcribing something they remembered, trying to give voice to a knowledge that had once been silent. The language of inheritance was being translated from geometry back into words. And as translations go, it was imperfect, fragmentary, but filled with longing for the lost original. Even the style of hieroglyphic art suggests memory rather than invention. The figures are always in profile, timeless and formal, as though copied from templates rather than drawn from life. The same symbols repeat across centuries with minimal change. In a culture that prized permanence, innovation was seen as disruption. The goal was to maintain continuity, to keep the chain unbroken between past and present. In that sense, the Great Pyramid, wordless and eternal, was the perfect model, a physical embodiment of unchanging truth. Modern scholars still search for a code in its dimensions. Ratios of base to height correspond to planetary distances. The tilt of its sides matches the curvature of the Earth, and its internal shafts seem to measure celestial time. It's tempting to think of it as a library, a compendium of knowledge encoded in stone. Perhaps the builders left it for whoever came next, knowing that civilizations rise and fall, but mathematics endures. To them, geometry might have been the purest language of all, one that could bridge epochs, even after words were lost. The Egyptians would later treat numbers as sacred. Every temple followed strict proportions, every statue obeyed canonical ratios. They believed harmony itself had measure. That belief may have been the echo of an inheritance, the memory of a time when builders and astronomers were one and the same, when the act of construction was also a prayer. It's strange to think that a civilization so eloquent could have inherited its greatest monument from people who left no words at all. And yet, silence can be the most enduring form of expression. The Great Pyramid doesn't tell us what it means, it invites us to listen. Its language isn't carved, it's felt, in the alignment of stars, in the weight of stone, in the faint hum of resonance that seems to vibrate through its chambers, like a heartbeat buried under centuries. If inheritance is the passing down of memory, then Egypt's inheritance was both literal and invisible. They inherited the land, the river, the flood, the stories, and perhaps this monument, a message too ancient to read. They surrounded it with their own symbols, built temples nearby, and spoke to it in the only way they knew, through ritual, offering, and repetition. But the pyramid itself never answered. It remained what it had always been, a teacher who speaks through silence. Over time, that silence became part of the Egyptian identity. To live under its shadow was to live with a mystery that could not be solved, only honoured. The priests recited hymns to the gods of the sky and the earth, invoking balance and renewal, Yet the oldest and most perfect structure in their land said nothing. It needed no voice. It was the voice. And in its quiet endurance, it taught them that some truths are not written to be read. They are built to be felt. The winds continue to move across the plateau, brushing against those wordless walls. The hieroglyphs carved elsewhere across Egypt still sing of kings and journeys, of death and rebirth. But the Great Pyramid remains apart, holding its tongue. Its message is not in what it says, but in what it withholds. A lesson in humility, perhaps, from a civilization long forgotten, reminding those who came after that knowledge is not always meant to be spoken aloud. As the moon rises over Giza, its light spills down the smooth edges, turning the limestone silver. The inscriptions on nearby temples shimmer faintly, but the pyramid remains blank, absorbing the glow like an ancient thought refusing to fade. The stars drift across its apex, the same stars that guided its design. Somewhere in that meeting of sky and stone, the language of inheritance continues to flow, unspoken, unreadable, yet somehow understood. And as the night deepens, the sands shift once more, whispering softly around the base. The story lingers there, carried forward by the rhythm of the desert, moving gently toward the next mystery. How knowledge itself can survive the flood of time, and how those who inherit it keep it alive without ever truly knowing where it began. If the Great Pyramid truly came from an older world, then what it preserved was more than stone. It carried a language of proportion, a rhythm of measurement, a logic of design that seems too consistent to be chance. It was not just built, it was remembered. Somewhere, deep in the folds of time, there must have been people who understood that memory could be fragile, that words could be lost, that the only way to keep knowledge alive through disaster was to carve it into the earth itself. Every civilization has known fear of loss, flood, fire, famine, war. The elements have always been larger than us. But now and then, the traces left behind suggest that some ancient builders didn't only fear destruction, they anticipated it. They planned for it. The pyramid may have been one such plan, a vault of geometry designed to survive the collapse of everything else. Even stripped of context, it still teaches. Every ratio, every angle, every alignment is an equation in disguise. The builders might have known that long after their language, their gods and their descendants were gone. The stone would still speak to anyone patient enough to listen through mathematics. The Egyptians called their ancestors the followers of Horus, divine beings who ruled before the first human kings. Their reigns, according to the old king lists, lasted tens of thousands of years. Scholars today treat those numbers as symbolic, yet numbers are rarely accidental in Egyptian lore. The lengths of reigns, the ages of gods, the spans of epochs, all are patterns, cycles repeating on cosmic scales. To them, memory was not linear. It was a wheel turning endlessly. The world was born, destroyed, and reborn. Knowledge rose and fell with it. If the Great Pyramid belongs to that cycle, it may represent a point on that wheel, a memory carved at the turning of an age. Across the world, similar memories appear. In Sumer, stories of kings before the flood. In India, the tales of lost ages called yugas, each ending in catastrophe. In Mesoamerica, the belief in worlds created and destroyed in succession. These are not the fables of a few isolated tribes. They're global recollections of survival. Some great event reset humanity, and those who endured carried fragments of knowledge with them. Astronomy, geometry, agriculture, metallurgy. They seeded the next wave of civilization with faint echoes of what they once knew. Perhaps those survivors were not engineers in our sense, but memory keepers, architects of continuity. They might have built stone circles in Britain, megalithic walls in Peru, terraces in Turkey, and pyramids in Egypt, all following the same impulse, to anchor human time to the stars. When the sky changes, memory fades. But if you align your monuments with the heavens, if you encode your science into the movements of stars, Then when the next world awakens, they'll see the pattern and understand that someone came before. The Great Pyramid, more than any other monument, feels like a product of that mentality. It's both local and cosmic, tied to its landscape and yet perfectly tuned to the larger order. Its sides face true north, with uncanny accuracy, deviating by only a fraction of a degree. Its base is square to the earth, and its apex once aligned with celestial north before the slow wobble of the planet's axis shifted the heavens slightly. Such precision demands more than skill, it demands purpose. You don't build something so exact merely to bury a king, you build it to speak across time. When we talk about inheritance, we often think of objects or property, but the greatest inheritance a civilization can receive is knowledge, not the kind written in books, but the kind embodied in habit, tradition, and design. The Egyptians inherited the art of alignment, the worship of the sun's cycle, the measurement of the flood's rhythm, and the understanding that order could be maintained through repetition. They didn't invent those things, they continued them. They acted as stewards of a memory that may have reached them in fragments, carried through stories of divine architects and heavenly teachers. Myths say that after the flood, the god Thoth taught mankind to rebuild civilization. He was said to have written down all wisdom in sacred books, hidden in a secret chamber beneath the earth. Those texts were never found, but the idea persists. Knowledge preserved beneath catastrophe, waiting to be rediscovered. The same idea appears in the legend of the Emerald Tablets, in the lost library of Alexandria, in the stories of hidden archives beneath Sphinx and sand. Whether or not any of these caches exist, the myth itself tells us what mattered most to those who came after. They believed that memory could survive destruction. There's a strange comfort in that thought. Humanity has always known it walks a narrow path between knowledge and forgetting. Every age must find ways to carry its understanding forward, through fire and flood, through language shifts and migrations. We do it now with data stored in the cloud, with archives frozen in vaults beneath polar ice, with satellites that hold our collective signal in orbit. In a way, the pyramid was an earlier version of that same impulse, a data capsule of stone, its code written in symmetry instead of silicon. When archaeologists study it, they measure, they map, they analyse. The angles tell them things, the volumes reveal patterns. It's as if they're decrypting something left behind deliberately for a later civilization to read. The structure even incorporates multiple systems of measurement, cubits, inches, meters, all interwoven in ratios that seem to anticipate units not yet invented. Some have argued that these coincidences are simply products of geometry, that any large structure can yield patterns if you look hard enough. But that argument feels thin when confronted with the sheer consistency of the pyramid's mathematics. It's too intentional, too disciplined. If we imagine the builders as the architects of memory, then everything about the pyramid becomes meaningful. Its height records a ratio of the Earth's dimensions. Its slope embodies pi and the golden mean. Its base encodes the equator's circumference. The pyramid becomes a map, a mirror of the planet itself. To a civilization rebuilding after cataclysm, what better way to preserve knowledge than to express it in the most durable form possible? A monument that is both model and message. Even the act of building it would have been a ritual of remembrance. Each block placed with awareness of its meaning, each alignment checked against the rising sun. It might have taken generations, not because of labour shortage, but because of reverence. To recreate a structure from memory is to restore connection to the past. The builders may not have fully understood what they were preserving, only that it mattered. That sense of duty, of carrying something sacred forward, may be what kept the project alive long enough to reach completion. It's not difficult to imagine how the story evolved after that. Centuries later, when new rulers emerged and old languages faded, the monument's purpose was forgotten. Its precision became myth, its design divine. The people who found it would have been overwhelmed. How could they claim ownership of something so perfect? They did what every civilization does when faced with incomprehensible inheritance. They sanctified it. They built their culture around it, drew their myths from its shape and called it the work of gods. The Egyptians saw the pyramid as a symbol of ascent, the sun's rays solidified in stone, its sides slanted like beams of light, leading upward toward the heavens. The word for pyramid, mer, may have meant place of ascent. That definition fits beautifully if the monument's true purpose was to bridge the gap between earth and sky, between memory and eternity. It was less a tomb than a reminder, a promise that knowledge, like the sun, always rises again. When you look at how civilizations respond to loss, you can almost trace their philosophies back to this idea. In Egypt, renewal was constant. Each morning the sun god Ra was reborn. Each year the Nile flooded, restoring life to the valley. Death itself was not an end but a transition, a moment in the cycle. Their entire worldview was an act of defiance against oblivion. That defiance might have been inherited too, born from the trauma of watching an earlier world drown. To lose everything once is to learn the necessity of preservation. The Great Pyramid, then, can be seen as a monument to resilience. Its silence is not emptiness, but discipline. The discipline of a civilization that refused to let memory die. The builders could have left inscriptions, myths, or instructions, but they must have known how fragile words are. Instead, they built a shape so fundamental that no language barrier could obscure it. Triangles, ratios, alignment, these are universal. They don't belong to culture, they belong to reality itself. By encoding their wisdom in geometry, they ensured that it would outlive them, even if their story was forgotten. There's a certain melancholy to that success. The knowledge survived, but the knowing did not. We stand before the pyramid today, surrounded by tools and data, yet still unable to replicate it with the same simplicity and durability. We've inherited the message, but not the understanding. The architects of memory succeeded beyond measure. They made sure their work endured, but in doing so, they ensured that future generations would forever wonder who they were. Sometimes preservation comes at the cost of identity. The monument survives, the builders vanish. The shape remains, the meaning fades. That might be the truest legacy of the Great Pyramid, not as a triumph of technology, but as a reminder that knowledge is fragile even when written in stone. The desert knows this lesson well. It hides and reveals, erases and restores. Buried beneath its shifting dunes are cities that once thrived, temples that once sang with prayer, and texts that once spoke of the gods. The pyramid stands above all that, resisting burial, holding its place against entropy. Every gust of sand, every passing storm, is part of a dialogue between creation and decay. The architects of memory understood that too. They built something that could breathe with time, weathering change without losing form. When the morning sun rises over Giza, it strikes the pyramid first. The light touches its apex before anything else in the landscape, and for a brief moment the monument glows as though reliving its own creation. Perhaps that moment was intentional, a daily reenactment of the world's rebirth after catastrophe. To those who built it, sunrise might have symbolized not just a new day, but a new world reclaimed from darkness. The pyramid becomes the Earth's first thought each morning, a memory waking again after the long night. In that way, it continues to do what it was meant to do. It endures, it instructs, it reminds. It carries forward an idea that civilization itself depends upon, that knowledge can survive even when those who carried it cannot. The architects of memory may be gone, their names washed away by flood or sand, but their design endures as an unspoken promise. They left behind a beacon, a structure built not just for the dead, but for those yet to come, proof that humanity could outlast disaster, and so, through millennia, their memory has persisted in the most human way, through wonder. Each generation that stands before the Great Pyramid, each eye that traces its angles against the sky, becomes part of the inheritance. we continue what they began. We question, we study, we preserve. The knowledge travels forward again, reshaped but alive, carried once more through time by those who refuse to stop remembering. The wind moves gently around the stones, the light fades, and the voices of the present dissolve into the quiet breath of the desert. Somewhere beneath that silence, the memory remains intact, a code that never lost its meaning, a structure that never forgot its purpose. The architects of memory may have vanished, but their creation still speaks, not in words, but in endurance. And as the night draws near, that endurance continues to whisper softly through the dark, a reminder that even after catastrophe, what we choose to remember can outlive the world itself. The Nile is a river that doesn't just flow through Egypt, it breathes through it. Every rise and fall of its water has written a new line in the story of the land, shaping cities, seasons, and civilizations. Its flood was the pulse of creation, its rhythm the calendar by which life was measured. But long before Egypt as we know it took form, before the first farmers laid irrigation channels, and before the first kings called themselves divine, the Nile was something else entirely. Wider, wilder, perhaps even older than the deserts around it. The river has never been still. It has shifted its course many times, carving new beds and abandoning old ones as the climate changed. Beneath the sands that seem timeless today, geologists have traced the ghostly scars of ancient channels, some so far west they once flowed through what is now endless dune. The landscape of Giza, which today lies dry and sun-bleached, may once have been green, humid, even lush. The wind that now scours the plateau may once have carried the scent of wet earth and grass. If the Great Pyramid predates Egypt's arid age, then its stones have seen more than human empires rise and fall. They have watched the very climate rewrite the shape of the land. To imagine that world, we have to picture a different Egypt, one where rain fell in steady patterns, where the desert was a savanna alive with life. Paleoclimatic studies show that the Sahara has not always been a desert. Between 12 and 6,000 years ago, monsoon rains reached far north, turning the region into a mosaic of rivers, lakes, and vegetation. Archaeological sites buried beneath dunes now reveal fish bones, water-worn tools, and rock carvings of giraffes and hippos. The air was thick with moisture then, the horizon painted in green. That humid phase, known to scientists as the African humid period, ended abruptly. Around 5,000 years ago, the monsoon retreated south, the rains faded, and the grasslands began to die. What had been water became sand. What had been lake became dust. It was in the shadow of that transformation that the first Egyptian dynasties emerged. Civilization, paradoxically, was born not in abundance, but in memory of loss. The Nile's predictable flood became the last echo of the vanished rains, and the people learned to live by its rhythm, honouring it as the final thread that connected them to the fertile world their ancestors had known. If the Great Pyramid was already standing when that shift occurred, then it would have watched the end of that green age, its base kissed by water that slowly receded into memory. The erosion marks on the Sphinx and nearby stone walls speak of such a transition. They are vertical, rounded and deep, signs of heavy rainfall, not drifting sand. That pattern doesn't belong to the climate of dynastic Egypt. It belongs to the climate of the humid past. The idea that the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid could have faced those ancient rains changes everything. It means that the builders, whoever they were, lived in a world where Egypt was not the Egypt we know. Their knowledge, their engineering, their sense of place came from a landscape that has long since vanished. The plateau we call Giza may once have stood beside a river wider than the Nile, a branch swollen with rainwater and seasonal floods that came not from a distant source in Ethiopia but from the skies above. As the rains withdrew, so did memory. The people who remained would have seen the world around them changing, lakes shrinking, plants dying, animals migrating north or south. Their survival would have depended on adaptation. They would have followed the last remaining water, settled closer to the Nile, and begun to reimagine life along its dependable current. The rise of agriculture, the control of the flood, and the reverence for the river itself all point to a culture learning to hold on to water the way it once held on to knowledge. The Nile became not just a resource, but a teacher, reminding them that stability can grow from change. Even today, you can read that lesson in the floodplain. The black silt deposited by the river each year was a renewal of creation, a thin, dark memory of the vanished green. The Egyptians saw it as the rebirth of life, a miniature version of the cosmic cycle that had shaped their myths. Each inundation reenacted the original moment of order rising from chaos, just as the world had once risen from the floodwaters of Nun. Perhaps that was no mere metaphor. Perhaps the memory of real floods, of rain that lasted generations, of storms that buried valleys and swallowed villages, survived in myth long after the rains themselves had ceased. The Nile's role as a bridge between eras is written even in its name. The Egyptians called it Iteru, the great river, and saw it as the pathway of time. To sail its length was to travel through the ages from south to north, from birth to death, from life to eternity. The river's flow mirrored the journey of the soul, but beneath that poetry lies geology. The Nile is one of the oldest rivers on Earth, older than most mountain ranges. It has seen continents shift and climates collapse. Its patience outlasts civilization. It remembers what we have forgotten. At Giza, the river once ran closer than it does now. The pyramid complex sits on a ridge that would have overlooked a wide floodplain, and recent studies have identified what appears to be an extinct branch of the Nile, now dry, running right up to the plateau. That proximity would have made transport of the massive stones possible by boat, but it also supports another idea, that the builders chose the site for its relationship to water, not just to the stars. The alignment of the pyramids, the causeways and the temples form a pattern that suggests deliberate connection between land, sky and river, a trinity of elements mirroring creation itself. To the Egyptians, water was not just sustenance, it was memory in motion. The annual flood carried the silt of past years, the minerals of ancient mountains, the seeds of renewal. Each current was a timeline, carrying yesterday into tomorrow. In that sense, the Nile was both the past and the future. The builders of the pyramid may have understood that better than we do, that time, like water, doesn't end or begin. It moves in cycles, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden beneath sand, but always flowing. When the desert eventually consumed the rains, Egypt adapted. Temples replaced rivers as centres of renewal. Ritual replaced weather. The sun became the symbol of the flood, rising, falling, and rising again. But beneath that adaptation, the memory of the older climate persisted. The myths of floods and rebirths, of gods who ruled during a wetter age, all stem from that environmental truth. Humanity had watched the world dry out, and in that desiccation it saw the pattern of life and death. To live in the desert is to learn to treasure water. To inherit a monument from the age of rain is to live with the ghost of abundance. Every civilization carries its geography within its soul. The Egyptians carried theirs in stone and story. They remembered water in the curve of their canals, in the shape of their gods, in the alignment of their monuments toward the river's path. Even their funerary texts describe the afterlife as a journey across celestial waters, the field of reeds, a place of eternal inundation where crops grow tall and life begins anew. That paradise was not imagined. It was remembered. It was the world that once existed before the desert took it away. The Great Pyramid's position may have been chosen to mirror that paradise, a mound rising from the flood, an eternal island of stone in an ocean of sand. Its base once kissed the edge of water, its reflection shimmering in the flooded fields at dawn. Perhaps that was part of its design, a monument to permanence surrounded by impermanence, a reminder that even as the world changes, something endures. When scientists core the sediment layers near Giza, they find alternating bands of clay, sand and silt, evidence of repeated flooding and retreat. Each layer is a page in the Book of Climate. Together, they tell a story of abundance followed by desiccation, of a land that once thrived under rain and then learned to live without it. Somewhere within those layers lies the dividing line between worlds, the moment when Egypt's green memory became the desert's silence. It's tempting to see the pyramid as a witness to that change. Perhaps the builders knew what was happening. Perhaps they saw the skies grow clearer, the storms less frequent, the grasslands fading at the horizon. They might have understood that the age of water was ending and sought to preserve what it meant. The pyramid then could be seen as both monument and message, a record of how the earth once was, a warning that nothing, not even climate, is eternal. The Nile today still performs its ancient duty, though modern dams have tamed its rhythm. It no longer floods as it once did, no longer leaves behind its annual silt. The cycle has been broken by human hands, yet the memory remains. Each ripple carries microscopic grains from the mountains of Ethiopia, fragments of volcanic rock that predate humanity itself. The river continues to deliver the past to the present, grain by grain, just as it always has. If you stand by its banks at night, you can feel that continuity. The air smells faintly of clay and wet stone, and the surface glimmers with starlight. Somewhere far upstream, raindrops fall in jungles the ancient Egyptians never knew, beginning a journey that will take months to reach the sea. By the time that water passes the plateau of Giza, it will flow past the oldest memory on Earth, the monument that has watched it for millennia, the keeper of a time when the desert was young and the sky was full of rain. The wind that sweeps across the plateau still carries traces of moisture from the river. It mingles with dust, brushes against limestone and drifts upward along the pyramid slope. It feels like the breath of history itself, cool, steady, patient. The same wind once carried the scent of rain over the same stone. The same air once rippled across green valleys where gazelles grazed and lakes mirrored the stars. The land remembers even when we don't. Somewhere beneath the sand, ancient shorelines remain, faint ridges of sediment marking where water once rose. Those silent traces tell us that Egypt's golden age was born from an ending, that civilization began not in the fullness of plenty, but in the memory of what was lost. The Great Pyramid stands as the last monument of that transition, its foundations sunk into what was once riverbank, its summit touching what was once sky. And as the night stretches over Giza, the desert cools, and the Nile continues its quiet journey north. The stars reflect in its surface, the same stars that guided the builders, the same constellations mirrored in the pyramid's alignment, water and light, past and present, earth and sky, all moving together through time, unbroken. The winds shift again, tracing faint ripples through sand that was once seabed, once lake, once river. The story carries on in that motion as the waters of time keep flowing, whispering of an Egypt that remembers not just the dawn of civilization, but the rain that came before it. The tools are always the question. No matter how many theories rise and fall around the Great Pyramid, it all returns to that simple problem. How did human hands 4,500 years ago, or perhaps much longer, shape and lift millions of tons of limestone and granite with precision that still confounds engineers? The official answer is copper chisels, dolerite pounding stones, wooden sleds, ropes and manpower. It sounds tidy, believable, efficient in a textbook way. But when you look closely at the evidence, the neatness unravels. Copper softens against granite like wax. Dolerite breaks before quartz yields. Wooden sleds crack under the strain of weight measured in hundreds of tons. The story works on paper better than it does in stone. Stand before the granite blocks inside the king's chamber, and you feel the argument immediately. Each slab weighs upward of 70 tons. The chamber's ceiling stones, massive beams of red granite, were quarried nearly 600 miles away at Aswan, floated down the Nile and hauled up the plateau. Even accepting the conventional methods, the logistics border on the impossible. How are the blocks lifted into place within a structure whose ascending corridors narrow to little more than the width of a man? How are they manoeuvred with such control that the joints between them are tight enough to stop a sheet of paper? These are not the questions of imagination, they are the questions of engineering. Archaeologists have found fragments of tools, small chisels, hammers and copper saws, but nothing that explains the perfect symmetry of certain cuts. The most precise work seems almost mechanical. Drill holes spiral with even pressure, as if turned by machine. Stone cores removed from those holes show patterns consistent with high rotational speed, the kind of consistency achieved with modern lathes. Some argue for the use of sand as an abrasive, a slurry of quartz that could have increased the cutting power of soft metal tools. Others suggest that the Egyptians mastered techniques now lost, perhaps using vibration, resonance, or even forms of heat treatment to soften the surface of stone. Whatever the case, the result is something that doesn't fully fit within our model of linear technological progress. The real puzzle may not be the stones themselves, but the mindset that shaped them. The builders worked with an understanding of material behaviour that feels instinctive rather than experimental. They didn't just cut blocks, they tuned them. The granite beams above the king's chamber, when struck, resonate at specific frequencies. Modern acoustic analysis suggests those frequencies correspond to the natural vibration of the chamber itself, as if the entire space was designed as a single instrument. That level of coordination implies testing, iteration, and knowledge of sound dynamics. It's possible that what we call construction was, to them, a form of harmonization. Matter arranged to echo the order of the cosmos. Imagine standing in the grand gallery while it was being built. The walls rise like steps toward the heavens, the air thick with the smell of stone dust and sweat. A single blow from a dolerite hammerhead rings through the passage like the toll of a bell. Each sound is measured, each echo noted. The workers, whether thousands or a disciplined few, move in rhythm, pulling, lifting, chiselling in a pattern that feels more like ritual than labour. Perhaps they didn't separate the practical from the spiritual. Perhaps to build perfectly, one had to build reverently. If the pyramid was an inheritance, then the tools might have been too. Methods passed down through generations, stripped of context but not of effect. Early Egyptian reliefs show artisans using bow drills and saws, yet these depictions could just as easily be symbolic continuations of a tradition older than writing. A people who survived catastrophe might have remembered the actions even after they forgot the reasons. They would mimic the gestures of their ancestors, the motion of drilling or cutting, believing the sacred pattern itself held the power. Over time, the tools became simpler, but the results lingered, as though the stones themselves still obeyed the old commands. The deeper mystery lies in the granite. This rock is unforgiving, harder than any tool known to the Old Kingdom. Yet the interiors of certain sarcophagi carved from it are mirror smooth, their corners perfectly square, their walls consistent to fractions of a millimetre. One lies inside the Serapeum at Saqqara, a black granite box weighing 70 tons, its lid cut so precisely it seals against air. No inscription claims it, no record describes its creation. It stands in darkness, like a machine awaiting an operator who never returned. These works echo the same intelligence that shaped Giza, an intelligence comfortable working with hardness itself, patient enough to coax perfection from material that resists it. Some researchers have suggested techniques involving abrasives under immense pressure, using ropes and sand to grind the surfaces flat. Others imagine water-assisted cutting or pounding with stone balls. Each theory answers one problem and creates another. To polish a single face of granite that size by hand would take years. To do it dozens of times consistently across hundreds of tons of material would take lifetimes. Yet the precision repeats. It's not an anomaly, it's a pattern. The question of copper is especially curious. The Egyptians knew bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, yet no trace of bronze tools has been found from the pyramid's early phase. Bronze would have made the job easier, but its absence is telling. Either they didn't have it, or they had something better. The idea of lost alloys, harder metals, or advanced techniques unsettles conventional archaeology. But history is full of vanishing technologies. The recipe for Greek fire, the Roman secret of concrete, the tempered steel of Damascus, all were known, perfected, and then forgotten. Why not something similar here? Even within mainstream Egyptology, there's acknowledgement that ancient engineers possessed ingenuity beyond expectation. They used levers, sleds, and lubricated tracks, combining physics and manpower with organisation we barely comprehend. The quarry marks at Aswan show evidence of controlled fracturing, heating the rock with fire, then cooling it rapidly with water to break it cleanly. They understood thermal expansion long before the concept was named. That knowledge, in the hands of a culture driven by cosmic order rather than profit or haste, could achieve miracles. Yet the feeling remains that we're seeing only the shadow of a greater capability. The precision, the uniformity, the understanding of stress distribution, all seem excessive for a tomb. The builders were not simply moving stone, they were encoding knowledge into its placement. Each block becomes a note in a symphony of weight and angle, tuned not for sound but for endurance. The pyramid's structure distributes pressure so evenly that it has survived earthquakes that flattened nearby cities. It's as though the builders anticipated every possible threat except curiosity. There's a quiet irony in that. The same silence that preserved the monument also ensures we will never fully understand it. We can analyse, measure and model, but the technique, whatever it was, remains invisible. The absence of evidence is not proof of mystery, but the perfection of the result makes ordinary explanations feel insufficient. The copper tools displayed in museums look like children's toys compared to the magnitude of their supposed work. They are gestures toward an answer rather than the answer itself. When you touch one of those ancient stones, the texture tells its own truth. Some surfaces are rough, pitted by time. Others are smooth as glass, edges sharp even after millennia of erosion. Run your hand along a seam, and you feel the difference between blocks measured by eye and blocks measured by something deeper, an intuition of geometry that transcends calculation. The builders weren't guessing, they were remembering. Maybe that's the secret. The pyramid's perfection wasn't achieved by inventing new tools, but by remembering principles old enough to feel natural. The line between technology and tradition is thinner than we think. A society that sees no division between science and spirituality can achieve precision not through machines but through meaning. To them, the work itself was sacred, and the perfection came from faith as much as from craft. As darkness settles over the plateau, the temperature drops, and the stone begins to breathe out the heat it stored during the day. The air around the pyramid hums faintly, a low vibration born from wind passing over countless seams and edges. It sounds almost like a sigh, as if the monument is releasing the memory of the hands that made it. Somewhere in that sound lies the answer, a language of effort and patience we no longer speak. The copper, the granite, the sand, the angles, all fragments of an instruction manual written in material rather than words. The builders might have believed that by aligning their work with the order of the cosmos, they were ensuring not just stability of structure but continuity of civilization. Each tool mark was a prayer, each polished surface a reflection of the heavens. To them, the act of building was a form of resurrection, the recreation of the world as it was in the beginning. The modern visitor, standing in that same silence, sees only the surface. The tools have vanished, the knowledge dissolved into myth, Yet the result remains unchanged. It's easy to forget that progress is not always a straight line. Sometimes it circles back on itself, leaving behind relics of forgotten genius. The pyramid is one of those relics, a reminder that human understanding has ebbed and flowed like the Nile, expanding and receding with each age. The night air grows cooler. The stars sharpen above the desert, their light falling across the limestone faces. Each glint seems to trace the edge of a hidden line, a blueprint still visible to anyone willing to look slowly enough. The stones hold their secrets without arrogance, without fear. They simply endure, content to let time and curiosity wear themselves away. And as the wind moves across the plateau, the story continues, not of lost machines or impossible science, but of memory carried through the hands of builders who understood that the greatest tools are not the ones we hold, but the ones we remember how to use. The copper may have dulled, the quarries may be silent, but the lesson remains in every line of the pyramid. That mastery once achieved can outlast even the age that forged it. There are nights over the Giza Plateau when the air is so still that the stars seem almost to rest on the horizon. The desert, stripped of its heat, becomes a sea of shadow, and the Great Pyramid rises from it like an island of geometry, adrift in eternity. In that silence, with the city lights muted and the wind gone, the sky becomes a mirror. The same constellations that look down upon the builders still hang there, precise and unblinking. They have been moving slowly, patiently, for tens of thousands of years, and yet to the eye they seem frozen, eternal watchers, waiting for someone to remember why they were once so carefully measured. If you could stand there in the dark and draw invisible lines between the 3 pyramids of Giza, you'd see a familiar shape emerge, 3 points tilted slightly off a straight line, matching perfectly the stars of Orion's belt. That pattern isn't coincidence. The Egyptians called those stars the souls of Osiris, the god of resurrection, whose body was scattered across the land and reassembled by his wife Isis, just as the Nile scattered and renewed life each year. To them, the sky wasn't separate from the earth, it was its reflection. Every motion above had its counterpart below. To live in balance with the heavens was to ensure the survival of the world. That belief was not a matter of superstition, it was science written as devotion. The Nile's floods came in rhythm with Sirius's rising, the bright star the Egyptians named Sopdet. When it appeared at dawn for the first time each year, the river would soon begin to swell. The heavens told them when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare for the inundation. Their calendar, their architecture, their myths, all turned on that same axis of observation. But the pyramids did more than mark the seasons, they embodied them. The Great Pyramid is lined to true north, with an accuracy that humbles modern instruments, only a fraction of a degree off, a precision unmatched by any other ancient monument. Its 4 sides face the cardinal points with near perfection, as if it were built under the guidance of celestial geometry rather than earthly sight. The builders would have needed to watch the stars for years, tracking their slow motion, correcting for the Earth precession, adjusting for the imperceptible drift that changes the heavens over millennia. Such awareness implies continuity, a lineage of observation stretching far back before Khufu's reign. The shafts within the pyramid add another layer to the mystery. One leads from the king's chamber toward the belt of Orion, another from the queen's chamber toward Sirius. The alignment isn't symbolic, it's precise, measurable. When the structure was new, those stars would have shone directly down the narrow tunnels, beams of light entering the heart of stone. It's as if the builders built not only for themselves but for the stars, as if the monument was meant to communicate with the sky. Some have suggested those shafts were meant for the soul of the pharaoh to ascend, a celestial highway guiding him to the afterlife. But if the pyramid predates Khufu, the alignment may tell a deeper story, that the monument was designed during an era when the night sky itself was different, when Orion's position matched the shafts exactly, a date around 10,500 BCE. That was the age remembered as Zep Tepi, the first time, the mythical dawn when gods ruled on Earth. It's also roughly when the last ice age ended, when floods reshaped continents and climates shifted. The coincidence of myth and astronomy is hard to ignore. Perhaps the alignment wasn't merely spiritual, it was chronological, a timestamp written in starlight, preserving the memory of when the monument was first conceived. In that view, the pyramid becomes not just a tomb, not even just an observatory, but a cosmic archive. Its geometry mirrors the orbit of the stars, its proportions reflect planetary cycles. The relationship between its height and perimeter encodes the ratio of Earth's size to its distance from the Sun. These patterns appear again and again, too consistent to dismiss as accident. The builders were thinking on scales beyond the human, translating the movement of heaven into stone, making time visible. To the ancient Egyptians, the sky was alive. Each star was a soul, each constellation a story. The Milky Way was the celestial reflection of the Nile, the river of eternity flowing through the heavens. The gods sailed upon it in golden barges, rising each dawn in the east, descending each dusk in the west. The Great Pyramid's position on the western bank of the Nile was deliberate. It stood at the edge of the land of the living, facing the setting sun, the gateway to the realm of the dead. Its sides caught the last light of day, glowing red before darkness fell, like embers of the sun carried down into night. The pyramid was both horizon and bridge, a structure built to unite opposites, life and death, sky and earth, mortal and divine. When the first rays of sunrise touched its apex, they would have illuminated a mirror image of what was happening in the heavens. Orion rose in the southern sky, Sirius shimmered near the horizon, and the cycle began anew. The monument became a compass not only for navigation, but for existence itself. To walk its base was to trace the perimeter of the Earth. To gaze along its slope was to follow the path of light from horizon to zenith. In that sense, the pyramid wasn't pointing to the stars. It was one, a mountain built from the same geometry that governs celestial motion. Even in ruin, that intent remains. The casing stones that once covered the pyramid's surface, gleaming white under the sun, would have reflected starlight at night. Imagine how it must have looked when new, a beacon visible for miles, its summit shining like a second star on the horizon. Some say that during certain nights of the year, when the air was clear and the moon dark, the pyramid seemed to vanish against the sky, its polished faces merging with the constellations above. To anyone standing on the plain, it would have felt as if the heavens had descended to earth. That image, stone mirroring sky, was the heart of Egypt's philosophy. As above, so below, they believed. Every temple was a reflection of the cosmos, every ritual an echo of celestial rhythm. The alignment of monuments across the landscape followed not whim but astronomy. Temples to the sun at Heliopolis, shrines to the stars at Dendera, entire cities planned in harmony with solstices and equinoxes. The builders were not simply honouring the heavens, they were participating in them. The act of aligning stone with starlight was an act of communion. If we accept that the Great Pyramid was inherited, then this cosmic language must have been part of the inheritance. The Egyptians didn't invent it, they preserved it. They watched the stars through lenses already focused by their ancestors, maintaining the same relationships, the same mathematical principles, the same sacred geometry. When they built temples, they followed a pattern set long before, perhaps by those who first charted the precession of the equinoxes, who first realized that the sky changes over ages, not years. That understanding requires patience beyond modern measure. To notice precession, you must watch the stars for generations, recording their positions and realizing that the heavens themselves are moving. It's not the kind of discovery one civilization makes quickly. It suggests continuity, an unbroken chain of observation stretching back into deep time. The pyramid's alignment might then represent the culmination of that effort, the moment when memory and astronomy merged into architecture. Even now, modern science confirms how deliberate that precision was. Satellite measurements reveal that the pyramid's base is oriented to true north more accurately than any other ancient or modern building until the 20th century. The difference between its sides is less than 2 centimetres across a span of more than 200 metres. The corners point almost exactly to the cardinal directions. To achieve that, the builders must have used the circumpolar stars, those that never set, to find celestial north. But they didn't just copy the sky, they engraved its mechanics into the ground. When viewed from above, the Giza complex forms not just the pattern of Orion's belt, but also mirrors the curvature of the Milky Way's arc as it crosses the night sky. The pyramids at Dashur and Saqqara extend that pattern southward, creating a map of heaven stretched across the desert. It's a scale model of the cosmos, as if the builders wanted to remind anyone who looked down from above, whether gods or later wanderers, that Earth too could be arranged in harmony with the stars. In their mythology, that harmony was the essence of Mut, the cosmic balance that held the universe together. To live outside it was to invite chaos, to live within it was to ensure eternity. The Great Pyramid was the anchor of that balance, the central note in a vast symphony of alignment that tied Egypt to the sky. The stars spoke in motion, and the stones answered in silence. Some modern astronomers dismiss these connections as coincidence, arguing that with enough monuments some will inevitably line up. But that explanation feels small beside the scale of intention visible at Giza. Coincidence doesn't create precision. Coincidence doesn't reproduce mathematical constants across continents or mirror celestial geometry in architecture designed for eternity. The pattern is too elegant, too consistent to belong to chance alone. When you stand at the pyramid's base and look up at the stars, you can feel that relationship still alive. The apex, dark against the sky, seems to point directly into infinity. The stars appear to drift around it, circling slowly, eternally, as if orbiting the monument itself. For a moment, you feel the illusion reverse. The sense that the sky is moving and the pyramid is still becomes the feeling that the pyramid is steadying the sky. Perhaps that was the builder's intent, to give the heavens an anchor, to make permanence visible. The desert wind begins to rise, soft and cold, brushing across the limestone. It whispers through the cracks, carrying sand that glitters under starlight. Somewhere in that sound, you can almost hear the murmur of those ancient astronomers, counting, measuring, aligning. Their language was numbers, their poetry geometry. They didn't separate science from spirit, or math from meaning. To them, each calculation was a prayer, each measurement an act of devotion. The night deepens, the stars move imperceptibly, the same way they have for tens of thousands of years. The Great Pyramid remains where it has always been, at the precise centre of gravity between heaven and earth. Its form reflects the constellations, its base echoes the curve of the Nile, its purpose transcends both. The mirror of the sky has not dimmed. Even after empires have fallen, after languages have died, after the desert has shifted and reclaimed so much, the dialogue between stone and star continues. The pyramid listens, the heavens answer, and in that silent exchange the oldest conversation on earth goes on. A conversation about order, endurance, and the dream of building something that can speak with the universe itself. The wind fades again, and the night returns to stillness. The stars lean closer, their light falling gently upon the worn limestone. The monument gleams faintly, as though remembering its youth, when its surfaces shone like starlight made solid. The silence feels vast but not empty. It is the silence of understanding, of a world that once knew how to listen to the sky and built a mountain to remind us never to forget how. And as the first hint of dawn glows faintly on the horizon, the mirror begins to shift. The stars pale, the sky brightens and the pyramid returns to shadow. But the memory of that alignment lingers, quiet and infinite, a connection between earth and heaven that no erosion, no empire and no forgetting has ever been able to erase. There has always been a dividing line between what is seen and what is believed, and nowhere is that line sharper than at Giza. The Great Pyramid has stood longer than any written explanation, longer than any nation, longer even than some of the stars it was built to mirror. And because of that, it draws two kinds of minds. The first kind searches for proof, for data, for the precision of measurement and logic. The second listens for something else, the echo of memory, the faint hum of meaning that lies beneath the measurable. Both look at the same monument, but what they see is not the same. The modern study of the pyramid began not with mystics, but with engineers. The 19th century explorers who crawled through its corridors came armed with tape measures, compasses and lanterns. They counted the stones, mapped the passages and calculated the angles, trying to decode the logic of its construction. Their reports read like scientific autopsies, meticulous, skeptical, sometimes awestruck despite themselves. Yet even the most rational among them couldn't escape the feeling that the structure was more than the sum of its parts. Colonel Howard Vase, who first uncovered the quarry marks in the upper chambers, called it a work beyond imagination. His measurements were impeccable, his conclusions cautious, but his tone betrayed something else, humility before a mystery that refused to shrink under scrutiny. Since then, the debate has never stopped. The scholars build their arguments from evidence, the skeptics from absence. Archaeologists point to the tools, the workers' village, the graffiti naming Khufu's cruise, and the nearby quarries as proof that the pyramid was a product of the 4th dynasty. They trace the evolution of design from the stepped pyramid of Giza to the smooth perfection of Giza, showing how each generation refined the techniques of the last. To them, the mystery lies not in who built it, but in how human determination and organisation reached such precision with the materials of their age. But the skeptics point elsewhere. They see the inconsistencies, the missing blueprints, the unexplained erosion, the silence of inscriptions, the scale of labour that seems to exceed population estimates. They note that the pyramid's design appears too perfect to be part of a learning curve, that instead of progress, the record shows decline. Later pyramids are smaller, rougher, less aligned. The art of Giza was never matched again. It's as if the first masterpiece was inherited, and everything that followed was an imitation of something remembered, but never fully understood. Science and mystery have circled each other ever since. Every new discovery seems to feed both sides. When archaeologists find remains of workers' villages, some see proof of organised labour. Others see repair crews restoring something already ancient. When radar scans reveal voids inside the structure, the scholars see construction gaps. The dreamers see hidden chambers, archives of forgotten knowledge. Neither side is entirely wrong. The evidence is there, but it speaks in riddles. Part of the challenge is that the pyramid exists on a scale that overwhelms context. Its base covers more than 13 acres. Its mass exceeds 5 million tons. Every block, even the smallest, weighs more than the heavier stones used in medieval cathedrals. It is so vast that it distorts time perception. You can walk along one side for minutes and still not reach the corner. The human mind struggles to hold such size while also believing that it was built with simple tools. For many, that tension is the birthplace of wonder. Belief often begins where measurement ends. The moment data runs out, imagination steps in. Some call it superstition, others intuition, but it's as old as curiosity itself. To stand before the pyramid and feel that something greater lingers behind the stone is not to reject reason. It's to acknowledge the limits of it. The scholars call that sentiment dangerous, a temptation to see patterns where none exist. Yet even the most skeptical observer must admit that this structure in its silence invites belief. Its precision demands explanation, but its endurance demands reverence. In the early 20th century, the Great Pyramid became a battleground of interpretation. Mathematicians found the constant of pi encoded in its proportions. Astronomers measured its orientation and declared it a cosmic compass. Others went further, seeing in its geometry a prophecy, a timeline of world events, a message from some vanished order. Those ideas were dismissed by academia, but they refused to die. The pyramid, after all, is the perfect vessel for projection, symmetrical, silent, eternal. It reflects not just the stars, but the mind of whoever studies it. Modern Egyptology resists that mysticism, preferring the tangible. They can point to the quarry marks naming Khufu, to the workers' barracks, to the sled tracks and copper chisels found nearby. These are artifacts, not allegories. To them, the pyramid is proof of what organised humanity can achieve without magic or myth. But even within that framework, certain puzzles remain unsolved. The precision of the casing stones, the astronomical alignments, the unknown purpose of certain passages. Science can measure, but it cannot yet translate meaning. That's where belief persists, not as fantasy, but as a recognition that facts alone may not complete the picture. The pyramid occupies a space where evidence and interpretation overlap, where data becomes philosophy. The skeptic asks for proof, the believer asks for purpose, and somewhere between them lies the truth, perhaps unreachable, perhaps hidden deliberately within the silence of the stone. Over time, the debate itself has become part of the monument's history. Each generation of scholars adds new tools, carbon dating, ground-penetrating radar, 3D modelling, and each finds new fragments of truth. They map internal anomalies, temperature variations, unexplained cavities. None of it reduces the mystery, it only refines it. The more precisely we measure, the more questions appear. It's as though the pyramid was designed to resist final explanation, to remain always just beyond reach, so that curiosity itself becomes the inheritance. There's something profoundly human about that balance between knowledge and wonder. The Egyptians themselves lived within it. Their priests were astronomers, their engineers were theologians, their builders were philosophers of stone. They never separated faith from function. When they aligned a temple to the sunrise, they were performing both a spiritual act and a mathematical one. They didn't argue about which was correct. To them, both were true. In that sense, the modern divide between scholar and skeptic may be an illusion of our own making, a reflection of how we've learned to split the world into categories that the ancients never knew. If the pyramid truly came from an older time, it may carry within it a way of thinking that unites those opposites. Its design doesn't ask you to choose between science and belief. It demonstrates that the two can coexist, that geometry can be sacred, that astronomy can be worship, that precision itself can be prayer. To see it that way is not to abandon reason, but to expand it, to remember that understanding the world once meant feeling connected to it. The skeptics are right to demand evidence, the scholars are right to measure, but both might miss what the monument has been showing all along, that the very act of questioning is the point. The pyramid doesn't answer, it provokes, it doesn't explain, it endures. It reminds us that certainty is fleeting, but curiosity lasts as long as stone. In the quiet hours after sunset, when the tourists have gone and the plateau returns to stillness, the debate fades. The voices of science and speculation fall silent under the desert wind. The pyramid remains, neither defending itself nor correcting anyone. It needs no argument. It has already survived every one of them. Somewhere above, the stars return to their slow drift, the same motion the builders once charted. Each point of light is both evidence and mystery, measurable yet infinite. The pyramid mirrors them still, catching their light, reflecting it back without taking sides. It stands between belief and proof, between history and memory, holding the balance. And as the night deepens, you realize that perhaps that's its real purpose. Not to be understood completely, but to keep us asking. To hold a mirror not just to the sky, but to the human mind itself, our need to know, our hunger to believe, our endless conversation between the seen and the unseen. The wind rises, brushing the sand across the base of the monument. In the starlight the edges blur, and for a moment the pyramid seems to dissolve into the night, neither solid nor immaterial, a thought made of stone. The arguments of centuries drift away like dust, leaving only the quiet truth that has always been there. That wonder, whether born of science or faith, is the beginning of understanding, not the end of it. The scholars will continue to measure, the skeptics will continue to question, and the pyramid will continue to listen, unchanging, patient, a witness to both sides. Its silence remains the final word, not because it hides the answer, but because it is the answer. Endurance without explanation, evidence without conclusion, belief without confession. And still in that silence, it waits, carrying the conversation forward into the next dawn. The same dawn that has followed it for thousands of years, the same light that touches its apex before it reaches the city below. The dialogue between stone and sky continues, and the old question lingers in the air, not who built it, not when, but why it still makes us look upward and feel something words can never quite define. There are places on Earth where the air itself feels older than the language used to describe it. Giza is one of those places. The desert hums with silence, and the wind that sweeps across the plateau carries not just sand but memory, fine-grained, invisible, unending. The Great Pyramid stands at the centre of it all, its angles catching the same light that once fell upon builders long forgotten. And as time folds over itself, stories rise where facts fall away. Myths begin not as fantasy, but as the only way memory knows how to survive when words are no longer enough. The Egyptians understood this instinctively. They didn't just remember through writing, they remembered through story. Their myths were not inventions, but vessels, carefully shaped to hold fragments of understanding that couldn't be reduced to lists or numbers. When the first dynasties came into being, those stories were already ancient. The tale of Osiris, of Isis, of Horus and Set, they were more than allegories. They were the coded memories of cycles that had already played out. A god slain and reborn mirrored the annual flood. The death of the sun each evening and its rebirth at dawn mirrored the passage of time itself. Myths became the architecture of remembrance. The legend of Zep Tepi, the first time, tells of gods who walked among humans, who raised order from chaos and built the foundations of civilization. To later historians, it sounds like creation myth, but to the ancients it was history remembered in the only form that could last. They weren't describing a world beyond reality. They were describing the beginning of their reality, perhaps a time after cataclysm, when memory and survival blurred together. When the floodwaters retreated and the survivors began to rebuild, they would have carried their knowledge not in libraries but in stories, repeating them until they became sacred. It's a pattern seen everywhere. In Mesopotamia, Utanapishtim survives a flood and preserves the seed of civilization. In India, Manu rescues the sacred knowledge from the waters. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulate the world after the deluge. In the Americas, the Popol Vuh recalls earlier ages destroyed by water and fire. The same rhythm repeats: loss, survival, rebuilding. The stories differ in name, but their structure is identical, a kind of collective memory stretching across continents. It's as if every culture inherited the same wound and found the same way to heal it, by turning catastrophe into myth. Over time, those myths became time capsules, repositories of truth preserved through symbolism. The flood may have been real, but its retelling became the moral spine of civilization. It reminded future generations that destruction is always followed by renewal, that the world can begin again. For the Egyptians, this idea was not just belief, it was the foundation of their entire system of thought. Each dawn reenacted creation. Each ritual replayed the act of restoring order. Each pyramid in its way was a physical version of that cycle, a monument built to outlast the flood of time itself. When the oral became written, memory gained form but lost fluidity. The hieroglyphs that covered the tombs and temples of later ages were fixed interpretations of older truths, but before they were etched into stone, those truths lived in rhythm and repetition, recited by priests, whispered by elders, passed from one generation to the next like a torch. In that transmission, myth carried both knowledge and warning. It preserved the awareness that human civilization rests on fragile ground. The flood stories weren't just about water. They were about time, about the inevitability of forgetting. The Great Pyramid, then, becomes the physical counterpart to those stories, a myth written in matter rather than speech. Myths evolve the way landscapes do. Wind reshapes them, culture erodes them, yet something of their original shape endures. In the same way that geological strata record different epochs of the Earth, stories record different epochs of human consciousness. Each retelling adds a new layer without erasing the old. Beneath the polished surfaces of Egyptian theology lie the rough foundations of prehistoric memory, echoes of a time when gods were not distant beings but ancestors, when creation was not an act but a recovery. That's why myths feel both distant and familiar. They speak to something we already know but can't quite articulate. The Egyptians may have sensed that their monuments were continuations of those myths, that by building in alignment with the stars, by encoding proportions and cycles into stone, they were not just commemorating the past but participating in it. To them, time was not linear. It was recursive, looping endlessly back to its source. To remember the first time was to recreate it. In that sense, every ritual, every carving, every hymn was a reenactment. The pyramid itself might have been the ultimate expression of that principle, a reenactment of creation rendered in stone. Its shape echoes the primeval mound that rose from the waters of chaos. Its summit points to the sky where the first light emerged. Its chambers trace the journey from death to rebirth. It doesn't just symbolize the story, it is the story translated from myth into geometry. Across civilizations, you can see the same impulse. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the step pyramids of Mesoamerica, the temples of Angkor, all were built as models of the cosmos, reflections of myths about beginnings. They aren't copies of one another, but responses to the same human need, to hold memory in form, to make permanence from impermanence. When a culture fears forgetting, it builds, and when its buildings outlast its language, the myth remains as the key that still fits the lock. Modern science, for all its precision, sometimes forgets that. It looks at myth as fiction, forgetting that fiction was once the safest vault for truth. Numbers can be lost, but stories can be remembered. A tale can cross centuries where a formula cannot. The Egyptians understood that mathematics and narrative were not separate. They were two languages telling the same story. The pyramid's proportions speak the language of geometry. The myths of Osiris and Ra speak the language of allegory. Both describe the same cycle: descent, division, rebirth. When we read ancient myths today, we often look for metaphor. But perhaps we should look for data, not the scientific kind, but the experiential kind. The encoded observations of real events witnessed through the eyes of survival. The myth of a sky darkened for days, a flood that wiped away cities, a god who fell and returned. These might all be memory's way of describing cosmic or environmental events. A comet impact, a shift in climate, a flood of rising seas, all transcribed into narrative so they could be remembered not as numbers but as lessons. The Egyptians, inheriting fragments of such memory, wove them into the framework of their religion. They placed their gods within time but made time cyclical so that nothing was ever truly lost. Their texts describe ages of light followed by darkness, of abundance followed by drought. The balance between them was not punishment but rhythm. the breathing of the universe. Myths taught that even chaos has its place, that every destruction prepares the way for creation. The same truth lies in the stones of the pyramid, which endures erosion not by resisting it, but by accepting it. Its surface changes, its angles soften, yet its shape remains. The form survives through adaptation, not denial, the same principle that allows myths to live on. If myths are the world's memory, then the Great Pyramid is the hard drive, the point where intangible story becomes tangible form. You can't read it the way you read a book, you have to experience it. Walk its base, feel the texture of the limestone, and you're tracing the perimeter of an ancient sentence. Look up along its slope and you're following the grammar of the stars. Stand in its shadow at noon, and you'll see time itself written in light and darkness, the sharp edge dividing day from night, like a line of script across the desert. The ancients may not have known the word symbol, but they lived by its logic. Every physical act was also spiritual, every structure an echo of a story. The pyramids were memory made visible. Even their placement on the western bank of the Nile carried meaning, west being the direction of the setting sun, of death, of the passage into the unseen. Yet for them, death was not final. It was another version of the flood, a temporary submersion before renewal. The tomb became a womb, the pyramid a seed of eternity. As centuries passed, myths preserved what history forgot. When dynasties fell and languages changed, when the desert buried cities and erased names, the stories endured. They were retold by priests, then by travellers, then by scholars, each time reshaped but still carrying the core. The memory of beginnings, the warning of endings, the promise of return. And through all those retellings, the Great Pyramid remained, confirming the myth without speaking a word. Today we read those myths differently. We call them allegories or metaphors, but they still work. They still make us remember that what we build, we also become. The story of the gods is the story of humanity learning how to survive time, by leaving behind more than bones or tools, by leaving symbols that can be rediscovered and reinterpreted. Each generation finds new meaning, but the foundation is the same, to endure. When we listen to those old stories now, they no longer sound like superstition. They sound like caution, like wisdom encoded in poetry. Do not forget, they whisper. Do not let the world's memory fade. The flood that wiped out the first cities might not return as water, but as forgetfulness, the kind that drowns civilizations from within. To remember, then, is an act of survival. The Great Pyramid performs that act endlessly. It has become the memory of the world, holding in its silence the proof that human hands once reached for permanence and almost found it. The myths that surround it are not separate from it. They are its voice, still speaking across time, reminding us that stories and stones are made of the same desire, to keep something alive. The wind moves again, brushing sand against the lower stones. Each grain once belonged to mountains older than history, worn down by rivers that no longer flow. The pyramid stands between those vanished rivers and the stars above, joining the two halves of memory, the earthly and the celestial, the measurable and the imagined. The myths that cling to it, in all their variations, are not illusions. They are echoes of that union. They remind us that knowledge without story is brittle, and that story without structure drifts away. Together they make endurance possible. As the night settles over Giza, the desert cools, and the stars appear one by one, the same stars that guided the builders and inspired the myths. The pyramid glows faintly under their light, its shape dissolving into shadow, its presence turning abstract, almost dreamlike. The world around it changes, but the memory it holds does not. It continues to speak in the language of silence, the same language the myths were written in before words, the language of pattern, rhythm, and return. And so the story carries on, as myths always do, adapting, surviving, reshaping themselves to fit the minds of those who listen. The Great Pyramid remains their companion, the physical testament to an idea that began before history, that memory can be built, that meaning can be preserved, and that even after thousands of years, the world can still remember itself through stone and story alike. If the Great Pyramid was inherited, not built, then the story of Egypt changes from invention to continuation. It becomes not the beginning of civilization, but the memory of a world already ancient. That possibility doesn't diminish Egypt's brilliance, it deepens it. It turns the civilization of the Nile into a bridge, one connecting what was lost to what was preserved, the forgotten to the remembered. And in that idea lies something quietly profound, that history is not always creation out of nothing, but the patient stewardship of what survived. Every civilization begins with inheritance, but few inherit stone that has already conquered time. The Egyptians would have found the pyramid as we find it now, monumental, inscrutable, precise beyond reason. Imagine approaching it not as an archaeologist, but as a farmer from the early Nile Valley, watching the sun strike its peak for the first time. You would see symmetry too exact to be chance, blocks too massive to have been lifted by your hands, angles too deliberate to belong to nature. It would not seem like architecture, it would seem divine. To inherit something like that would shape an entire worldview. The first kings of the Nile might have seen themselves not as inventors of order, but as its keepers. Their divine titles, their rituals of renewal, their obsession with eternity, all could stem from the responsibility of tending a legacy they didn't fully understand. To them, the pyramid wasn't simply old, it was eternal, already ancient when the Nile still shifted its course. To live in its shadow was to be reminded daily that greatness could exist before one's own time, that wisdom might descend rather than ascend. Such awareness might explain Egypt's peculiar relationship with progress. Unlike later empires, the Egyptians did not strive for change. They sought continuity. Their art remained consistent for thousands of years. Their language evolved slowly, reverently. Their temples followed strict proportions derived from older blueprints. Everything they built to echo something older. That constancy was not stagnation. It was devotion. To them, perfection had already been achieved once. The task of the living was not to improve upon it, but to maintain it. This reverence for the past saturates Egyptian thought. Their word for tradition, Zep Tepi the first time, wasn't a date. It was a state of being. Each ritual, each festival, each coronation was an attempt to return to that original order. The pharaoh, standing at the centre of creation, didn't create the world anew. He rebalanced it, kept it aligned with the harmony set long ago. If the Great Pyramid came from an older age, then that sense of balance was literal. The entire civilization would have been modelled after a memory, an attempt to keep living within a pattern they inherited from the builders of that mountain of stone. There is humility in such a worldview, though it's often hidden beneath the grandeur of monuments. The Egyptians were not arrogant in their perfectionism. They were careful. They didn't see their knowledge as theirs alone. They saw themselves as conduits of something eternal. The texts on temple walls often speak of restoring what was before, rebuilding what was found in ruin, doing as the ancestors did. To modernize, those phrases might seem formulaic. To them they were sacred. The act of remembering was the highest form of creation. If Egypt inherited the pyramid, then it also inherited the question of purpose. What did the original builders intend? Was it a tomb, a temple, a machine of measure, a library of geometry? The Egyptians may not have known. Their genius was to adapt rather than to erase. They turned the structure into a foundation for their own theology, reinterpreting its silence through their myths. The nameless builders became gods. The unmarked chambers became gateways to eternity. They translated mystery into religion. That translation preserved the essence, even if the meaning changed. In their retelling, the pyramid became the stairway of the pharaoh's soul, the axis connecting earth and heaven. The rituals performed around it kept alive the older principle that life and death, creation and decay are part of a single cycle. By embedding those ideas into their belief system, the Egyptians ensured that the inherited monument continued to function, not as a relic, but as a living symbol. It's possible that this inheritance shaped not only their architecture but their ethics. The concept of ma'at, balance, order, truth, is not about invention, but about maintenance. It's about keeping the world aligned with a cosmic pattern that already exists. The pharaoh's duty was not to conquer new lands, but to preserve ma'at within his own. That philosophy may have been born from the awareness that the greatest works already stood before them. When you live in the shadow of perfection, ambition becomes responsibility. There's a quiet weight to that kind of inheritance. It's not the burden of labour, but of meaning. To maintain something ancient requires faith. Faith that the original builders knew what they were doing, even if their language and intentions are gone. The Egyptians carried that faith like a torch through centuries. Their calendar, their rituals, even their city planning followed celestial alignments traced back to an earlier age. They weren't simply honouring the past, they were protecting it from extinction. When modern eyes look at Egypt, they often see beginnings, the birth of writing, of organised religion, of monumental architecture. But if Egypt was an inheritor, then what we call beginnings were continuations. The first hieroglyphs might have been echoes of a script already lost. The earliest temples might have been restorations of structures already ancient. Civilization itself might have been a memory trying to sustain itself after catastrophe. The Egyptians, then, were not pioneers in the modern sense. They were restorers, guardians of memory. Such an inheritance carries paradox. It gives a civilization direction but limits its horizon. If perfection already existed in the past, what remains for the future? Perhaps that's why Egyptian culture feels timeless, trapped in a loop of renewal, not striving for innovation, but for endurance. Their achievements, monumental as they are, bear the calm of inevitability rather than the thrill of discovery. To them, to change was to risk breaking the chain. And so they built to last, not to evolve. This devotion to permanence is why their monuments still stand. They were not made for kings who sought glory. They were made for a civilization that sought continuity. Each temple, each tomb, each carved stone was part of a single unbroken statement. That order must outlive chaos. In that light, inheritance becomes not just an act of remembrance, but of defiance, a refusal to let the past disappear. The Great Pyramid in this view is both a gift and a mirror. It reflects the greatness of those who built it and the reverence of those who kept it. The Egyptians didn't need to surpass it, they needed to honour it. Their genius lay in creating an entire worldview capable of preserving something they didn't invent. Few civilizations have done that. Most inherit the past only to overwrite it. Egypt absorbed it, sustained it, and made it sacred. Even their mythology of descent from gods might be a poetic acknowledgement of inheritance. The gods of Zep-Tepi, the divine beings who ruled before the pharaohs, could be the memory of the original builders transformed by millennia of retelling. By calling them gods, the Egyptians expressed both gratitude and distance. They elevated the unknown ancestors to immortality, placing them in the heavens where their memory could never fade. In doing so, they preserved not only the structures but the reverence they inspired. That reverence survives even now. Every archaeologist, every visitor, every scholar who walks the Giza Plateau becomes part of the same lineage of wonder. We inherit not the stone, but the feeling, that awareness of standing before something that predates explanation. The same feeling that might have moved the first Egyptians to bow before it moves us still. The pyramid doesn't demand worship, it inspires continuity. It tells us that to live meaningfully is to remember deeply. Inheritance, then, is not a passive act. It requires choice. The Egyptians chose to preserve. They could have dismantled the pyramid for stone, reused its blocks for their own projects, erased its mystery by claiming it outright. Instead, they built around it, mirrored it, learned from it. They allowed its silence to become their teacher. That decision shaped the destiny of their civilization. When we consider what it means to inherit the past, we might see ourselves in that reflection. We too live surrounded by legacies we didn't create. Languages, sciences, stories, and ideas passed down through time. We inherit the ruins and the wisdom, the failures and the triumphs. The question isn't whether the past belongs to us, but whether we belong to it. The Egyptians answered yes. They built their world as an act of gratitude toward those who came before. As the night deepens over Giza, the lights of the city flicker in the distance, but the pyramid remains dark, unlit, indifferent to the passage of modern time. The same stars that shone over its construction shimmer above it now, ancient and steady. Each grain of sand that drifts against its base carries the memory of another world. One Egypt may have inherited without fully knowing, one we're still trying to remember. The weight of that legacy is not measured in tons, but in meaning. It is the awareness that we are temporary, yet capable of preserving the eternal. The Egyptians lived with that awareness every day. They walked in the presence of eternity made visible, and from it they drew their sense of order, beauty, and purpose. To them, the pyramid wasn't a relic. It was proof that civilization could outlast oblivion if it chose to honor rather than forget. The wind settles, the horizon fades into darkness, and the pyramid remains, the same patient shape against the same unbroken sky. Its stones do not speak, but their silence tells a story older than any name. If Egypt inherited the past, then so do we, each in our own way. We inherit the questions, the awe, the fragile continuity that links memory to meaning. The builders are gone, the dynasties have fallen, but the legacy endures, waiting for us to carry it forward as those before us once did. When the last light of day slips beneath the desert's edge and the wind softens to nothing more than a sigh, the Great Pyramid becomes almost invisible. The limestone, darkened by shadow, blends with the horizon, and for a brief moment it feels as if it has dissolved back into the night that once gave it birth. The stars emerge above it one by one, bright and steady, forming the same constellations that looked down upon the builders thousands of years ago. And though empires have risen and fallen, languages have lived and died, and the world itself has changed beyond recognition, the relationship between that pyramid and that sky remains untouched. It is a dialogue that has outlasted history itself. Every civilization has looked upward to measure its place in the cosmos, but none fused heaven and earth as completely as Egypt did. Their monuments were not built merely on land. They were built into alignment with the stars. The Great Pyramid is more than architecture. It is astronomy rendered in stone. Its edges point to the cardinal directions with such accuracy that even today, with lasers and satellites, its orientation stands almost perfect. The north it faces is the north of eternity, not magnetism, the pole of the heavens, fixed by observation, unchanged across millennia. The pyramid's sides catch the equinox sun with surgical precision, its shadows marking the turning of the seasons like a clock vast enough for gods. At night, the connection deepens. The shaft from the king's chamber once aimed directly at Al-Nitak, the easternmost star in Orion's belt, the same constellation the Egyptians associated with Osiris, lord of the afterlife and rebirth. Another shaft pointed towards Sirius, the star of Isis, whose rising heralded the flood of the Nile. The design is deliberate, intimate. Light from those stars would have entered the pyramid only at certain moments, penetrating its inner darkness, joining heaven and earth in a flash of cosmic recognition. It's easy to imagine that moment, the night so still you could hear your own breath, the shaft glowing faintly as a single beam of starlight touched stone polished smooth by human hands. In that instant, the monument became alive, part of the machinery of the universe. That connection has never broken. The stars continue their slow movement across the sky, but the pyramid still listens, still waits for the same alignments to return through the great cycles of time. Precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, changes the map of the heavens, shifting constellations over thousands of years. Yet the pyramid's position remains fixed, a marker of the sky as it once was. In that sense, it's not only a monument to eternity, but a time capsule of the heavens. Its angles preserve the memory of a sky long vanished, a map frozen in stone. When modern astronomers project backward the movement of Orion's belt, they find that the pyramid's alignment fits the sky of around 10,500 BCE, the same epoch the Egyptians called the first time. It's as if the pyramid was built to remember something the world had already forgotten. A celestial arrangement, a cosmic dawn, a moment when heaven and earth were closer than they are now. Perhaps the builders wanted to preserve not just a structure, but a sky. The stars, after all, are the only true constants in a changing world. Mountains erode, rivers dry, kingdoms crumble, but the light from a distant sun takes millennia to fade. To anchor a monument to that light is to place it beyond the reach of decay. Even now, standing on the plateau at midnight, the relationship feels tangible. The air is cool, the desert hushed, the sky vast and flawless. The stars seem to pulse with slow rhythm, and the pyramid below mirrors their stillness. There's a balance there, a kind of equilibrium that transcends explanation. The same geometry that governs the stars governs the stone. Both obey the same laws, both move according to the same patterns. To look at one is to understand the other. The Egyptians believed that the soul of the king ascended to the heavens after death, joining the imperishable stars that never set. They called them the circumpolar stars, the undying ones, and they mark the northern sky, revolving endlessly around the celestial pole. To them, immortality wasn't a promise of the afterlife, but a state of alignment. To live forever was to move with the stars, to keep pace with the cosmos. The Great Pyramid, oriented so perfectly to the pole, became the ladder of that ascent, a fixed point through which the soul could pass into eternity. If the structure was inherited, then perhaps this understanding was inherited too, a fragment of cosmic science remembered as religion. The builders may have known, in ways now lost, that the stars were not static, that time itself was cyclical. The pyramid's perfection suggests knowledge of precession, of axial tilt, of measurements so vast they can only be seen over generations. Such awareness doesn't belong to guesswork. It belongs to continuity, to observation sustained through ages. The Egyptians, and those before them, were not watching the sky for curiosity. They were listening to it. Modern science can now measure the same motions, chart the same patterns, explain them through physics, yet the awe remains unchanged. To realize that the pyramid's builders encoded those same cosmic truths using only the naked eye and the human will is to glimpse something extraordinary. They didn't need telescopes, they had patience. They didn't need equations, they had repetition. Every night, for centuries, they watched the heavens and learned its language until they could speak it fluently in stone. That's why the monument still feels alive. It isn't merely a remnant of the past, it's part of an ongoing conversation. When the stars shift, the pyramid marks their passing. When the wind moves, it carves the same grooves along its face, shaping it subtly as time moves on. Even erosion becomes participation, as if the monument ages with the universe it mirrors. It doesn't resist time, it joins it, changing so slowly that its transformation aligns with the turning of the heavens themselves. The stars above Giza have witnessed everything that has passed since the first light fell upon its summit. The rise of Memphis and Thebes, the invasions of foreign kings, the slow retreat of the Nile's floods, the hum of modern cities where chariots once rolled. Empires have used it as quarry, as temple, as calendar, as mystery. But through all of it, it has remained what it always was, a stillness against which time measures itself. It's said that to truly understand a civilization, one must look at what it worshipped. Egypt worshipped alignment, the harmony between motion and form, between heaven and earth. The Great Pyramid is that worship made visible. It doesn't seek to dominate the sky, it reflects it. Its perfection isn't an act of control but of surrender to the order already written above. To build such a thing required not only knowledge, but faith. The builders believed that to replicate the cosmos was to share in its immortality. They succeeded. The stars have shifted, but the pyramid still gazes upward, patient, indifferent to the passing of kings and calendars. In the modern world, where everything changes faster than memory can keep up, such endurance feels alien. We build for function, not for forever. We measure progress by novelty, not longevity. The Great Pyramid stands as the opposite of that impulse. It asks for stillness. It invites patience. It shows what can happen when a civilization chooses permanence over speed. Its builders didn't think in centuries or dynasties. They thought in cosmic time, in the turning of stars, in the rising and falling of ages. At night, when the wind drops and the sand settles, it's possible to feel the weight of that vision. The pyramid doesn't glow or sing or reveal its secrets. It simply exists, steady and unmoved. The stars revolve around it as they always have, and for a moment the boundary between ancient and modern dissolves. You become one more observer in an unbroken chain stretching back thousands of years, watching the same lights, standing before the same shadow. It's a kind of communion that needs no language. The pyramid doesn't speak to us. It allows us to listen. Its endurance isn't a matter of luck. It's the product of understanding. An architecture so attuned to natural law that it becomes indistinguishable from it. The angle of its sides disperses heat evenly, protecting it from thermal stress. Its core blocks are arranged in interlocking layers, absorbing earthquakes instead of resisting them. Its foundation follows the contours of the bedrock, anchoring it not on but within the earth. Every decision reflects not conquest over nature, but collaboration with it. The builders didn't fight the elements, they worked with them. That harmony may be the truest secret of its longevity. To the Egyptians, eternity was not infinite time, but perfect order. Something eternal did not last forever by accident. It lasted because it was in balance. The pyramid embodies that idea with absolute clarity. Its geometry is order crystallized. Its presence is timeless, not because it defies change, but because it aligns with it. The stars move, and so does the earth. Yet the pyramid remains at the center of both motions, fixed by design, revolving with the planet while keeping its orientation to the heavens. It is both participant and observer, mortal and eternal, human and cosmic. Even now, as satellites orbit overhead, as planes draw thin white lines across the night sky, the pyramid stands beneath them all, older than the idea of technology, more advanced than the precision of modern machines. It doesn't compete with progress, it outlasts it. The stars it once pointed toward have shifted, yet new stars have taken their place, and the alignment still holds, because the principle never changes. Harmony remains harmony, no matter the age. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world begins to pale from indigo to silver, the pyramid's edges emerge again from darkness. The first light touches its summit, then slides slowly down its face, turning the stone gold for a heartbeat before the day begins. It's the same light that rose over it thousands of years ago, the same dawn that has followed every night since. The pyramid doesn't greet the sun, it remembers it. Each sunrise is another cycle completed, another moment added to a ledger that stretches beyond counting. Perhaps that is why it still moves us, because it embodies what we've forgotten how to practice. Endurance through alignment, meaning through patience, power through stillness. The Great Pyramid doesn't exist to be solved. It exists to remind. Its gaze fixed on the sky is not the curiosity of the unknown, but the recognition of the eternal. It has already seen every answer we are still trying to find. The stars continue their slow drift, indifferent and infinite. The pyramid continues to watch, unblinking. Between them, the night hums softly, a bridge of silence connecting what was, what is, and what will be. The dialogue between stone and sky has never ended. It never will. It carries on in perfect stillness, as the world below continues to change and forget and begin again. Somewhere in that silence lies the essence of time itself. Not the ticking of clocks, but the pulse of existence, steady and unbroken. The Great Pyramid doesn't count time, it embodies it. It has become what it was always meant to be. The timeless stone, forever watching the stars, forever reflecting the order they reveal. And as the first warmth of the morning sun begins to spill over the horizon, the desert awakens once more, and the ancient monument stands where it always has, its gaze unwavering, its purpose fulfilled, not to dominate the heavens, but to remember them, so that even when we no longer do, something still will.